Welcome to Candlelit History, where stories of the distant past are told slowly, softly, by the glow of memory. So close your eyes, let the noise of the present fade, and listen as we travel back, not just before history, not just before kings, but before even the idea of time itself. This is where everything began. Before kings, before gods, before memory. There was silence. The earth was still new, its surface molten and angry, a spinning ember suspended in the dark. Lightning split the sky, oceans boiled, mountains rose and fell like waves. For millions of years, the planet was a chaos of storms and stone, until at last it cooled enough to hold water, and rain began to fall. It fell for centuries. It filled the craters, the valleys, the wounds of creation, and made oceans where there had been fire. Somewhere in those endless waters, life took its first breath, not with lungs or thought, but with chemistry. A few molecules colliding in the right rhythm, a chain of carbon, a flicker of reaction, a structure that could copy itself. It was not aware. It did not know it had begun something eternal. But in that moment, the universe learned to remember. One became two, two became countless. Single cells joined and split, dancing to the pulse of sunlight and minerals. They learned to draw power from light, to transform air into sustenance, to create oxygen. The seas filled with this invisible exhalation, the first breath of a planet that was beginning to live. For 3 billion years, nothing but the patient work of evolution. The oceans teemed with jellyfish and worms, with creatures that saw only through the dim pulse of instinct. Then, by accident or design, life decided to change its shape again. Fins became limbs. Eyes turned toward land. A few small creatures crawled from the sea onto the shore, blinking in the blinding light. It was the beginning of a new world. Time moved slowly, measured not in years, but in catastrophes. Continents shifted, mountains rose and crumbled, the earth endured ice ages and infernos. And through it all life persisted, stubborn, experimental, endlessly creative. From reptiles to mammals, from teeth to thought, evolution sculpted and discarded until it reached a new possibility. A creature with hands, with curiosity, with fire. The first humans were not the masters of their world. They were survivors, fragile and clever. They watched lightning split the sky and dared to steal its flame. They learned to cook, to stay warm, to keep the night at bay. Fire became both shield and teacher. It tamed hunger and gave shape to stories. Around the glow of the first campfires, humanity discovered itself, not just as animal, but as something else entirely, a being that could dream. They painted on cave walls, reaching with pigments and ash for what they could not yet name. Herds of bison, human figures, mid-dance, the ghost of a hand pressed in red ochre. The artists of those caves lived tens of thousands of years before history, but their intent is unmistakable. They wanted to say, "We were here." In that simple act, art was born, and with it, memory became more than survival. From memory came meaning, from meaning came story. Language rose like a tide, slowly, syllable by syllable. The call that once warned of danger became a word for danger itself. Gestures became sentences. Voices carried emotion, then ideas. Humanity began to speak, not just to survive, but to understand. In the darkness of prehistory, language was light. It turned tribes into families, families into communities. It allowed knowledge to cross generations, like embers passed from one fire to another. And as language grew, so did imagination. Humanity began to see gods in the thunder, patterns in the stars, purpose in the hunt. The mind expanded beyond the body's limits, and in doing so, invented time. But consciousness came with a cost. To know the world was to know loss. The same minds that could imagine beauty could also imagine death. The first burials, the first flowers laid beside bones, were acts of mourning and hope. Hope that something continued beyond the final breath. Humanity, for the first time, was not just living, it was searching. The search led us across continents, from the plains of Africa to the icy edges of Siberia. We wandered, following herds, rivers, and seasons. We learned to shape stone, to carve bone, to build shelters. We learned to cooperate and to compete. The fire spread from one valley to the next, carried in hands, in hearts, in stories. The world filled with the hum of thought. For hundreds of thousands of years, humanity lived as hunters and gatherers, nomads bound to the pulse of nature. Every sunrise brought both promise and peril. The land gave, the land took. Then about 12,000 years ago, as the last ice age ended, the rhythm changed. The wild grasses that fed us began to thrive in the warming soil. Someone, we'll never know who, looked at those seeds and thought, what if they could be tamed? That thought was the beginning of civilization. To plant a seed is to believe in tomorrow. To wait for it to grow is to imagine the future. From that act of faith came everything that followed. Villages, cities, nations, gods, governments, empires. The first farmers traded freedom for stability, and in doing so they anchored humanity to place and time. The long journey of wandering was ending. A new journey, the story of ownership, of hierarchy, of written memory, was about to begin. It all began with one quiet decision to stay, to make home from wilderness, to trust the earth to feed us. That was the moment when humanity stopped surviving and started shaping. The seeds we planted would feed us, but they would also bind us to the soil, to the seasons, to each other. Everything that defines civilization, art, war, law, worship, began as an echo of that first seed in the ground. The same impulse that tamed fire now tamed the earth. And yet, deep within us, the memory of those early flames still burns, the restless instinct to move, to create, to seek. Civilization may have begun with the field, but the fire that started it came from the hunt, from the stars, from that spark of curiosity that first made us human. The story of us, of everything we've ever built, worshipped, destroyed, or dreamed, begins not in temples or cities, but in that moment when the world's first life decided to keep going. That instinct, that will to exist, still hums in every breath we take. We are the continuation of that ancient decision to endure, to grow, to change. And now, as you sit beneath the same stars our ancestors once feared and worshipped, remember their story is yours. The same atoms that burned in the first fires now live in your veins. The same breath that stirred in the first oceans fills your lungs. Civilization began in you, and it continues every time you choose to learn, to create, to light a small flame in the dark. If this story spoke to the spark in you, subscribe to Candlelit History, where we keep the past alive, one flame at a time. Like, share, and stay close to the fire, because history is a circle, and it burns brighter when we gather around it together. The world warmed. Ice withdrew into the poles, rivers swelled, and the land that had once been wild and wandering began to settle into rhythm. Humanity, too, began to change. After hundreds of thousands of years of chasing the horizon, of living by the hunt and the season, something remarkable stirred within us. A quiet patience. We learned to wait. At first it was small and unremarkable. People noticed that where seeds had fallen, new plants returned. They saw the rhythm of life repeating itself in the soil. What began as observation became intention. We began to plant. It was a revolution without battles or kings, a transformation that happened slowly, almost invisibly, across generations. The hunter's path gave way to the farmer's field. Villages appeared like constellations across fertile valleys. The Tigris and Euphrates, the Nile, the Indus, the Yellow River. This was the birth of settlement, humanity's great bargain with time. By anchoring ourselves to the land, we traded freedom for predictability. The earth could now provide more food than a single family could eat. And with abundance came everything that defines civilization: property, hierarchy, invention, conflict, and art. The earliest known settlements were humble clusters of mud brick huts, surrounded by fields of barley and wheat. But in those walls lay the first true architecture, not of stone but of intention. For the first time, people built not just for shelter, but for permanence. They shaped their world and expected it to remember them. At the heart of every settlement was the same pulse: the field, the fire, and the water. The field fed the body, the fire kept the cold away, and the river carried life itself. Irrigation, fish, clay. Humanity was learning to engineer nature. We built canals to redirect floods, dikes to protect harvests, and storage pits to hold grain through the winter. These were not mere survival tactics. They were acts of creation. The first farmers did not think of themselves as revolutionaries, yet they were inventing the future. Their labor transformed the environment so profoundly that the earth itself began to change. Forests became fields, animals once wild became docile, dogs for herding, goats for milk, cattle for plowing. The wilderness shrank as the human footprint expanded, invisible but unstoppable. In time, settlements grew from hamlets into villages, villages into proto-cities. With more people came new challenges: food distribution, protection, cooperation. The hunter's instinct for independence had to yield to collective survival. Rules were born. Someone, somewhere, became the first leader. Not a king, not yet, but a voice that carried weight. Perhaps an elder who remembered the floods, or a priest who spoke for the gods of rain and sun. Hierarchy took root in the same soil as grain. The world's first societies formed around that balance of power between those who worked the earth and those who interpreted it. The farmer bent to the soil, the shaman to the sky. Each claimed mastery over a different realm, and civilization was the child of their uneasy truce. It wasn't peace that built these settlements, it was necessity. Hunger made cooperation non-negotiable. The earliest towns were not idyllic havens, they were experiments in endurance. Disease spread easily, crop failures could mean death for hundreds. Walls were built not for beauty, but for defense, from rival tribes, from wild animals, from the unpredictability of the land itself. Still, within these crude enclosures, something beautiful took root. In the quiet hours after work, families gathered by the hearth to tell stories. Myths began to form. Tales of gods who brought the rain, spirits that lived in rivers, ancestors who watched over the fields. These stories were more than entertainment. They were instruction, memory, the moral code of survival. The divine was no longer distant. It lived in the earth itself, in fertility, in harvest, in the cycles of life and death. Women, as bearers of both children and crops, often stood at the center of this early spirituality. Clay figurines of full-bodied goddesses, carved by firelight, have been found buried in ancient homes from Anatolia to the Danube. Their faces are serene, timeless. They speak of reverence for creation, both human and natural. As generations passed, the act of farming became ritual. Planting was a prayer, harvest, a celebration. To live meant to honor the soil. Every sunrise was a covenant renewed between humanity and the land. But permanence brought its shadows. Ownership entered the story when a man could point to a plot of earth and say mine. Something in the human spirit shifted. Greed, once meaningless among nomads, found purpose. Land became wealth. Wealth became power. The first fences, drawn in dust and stone, divided not just property, but people. Inequality was born quietly, in the counting of grain. Some hoarded, some served. Those who controlled the surplus controlled the community. The first social hierarchies emerged not from conquest, but from calculation. Civilization was learning to measure, and in measuring, to divide. Still, humanity's greatest leap was not in farming, nor in power, but in memory. Settled life required record-keeping, an entirely new form of thought. When harvests had to be tracked, when debts had to be remembered, when offerings to the gods had to be tallied, language found a new shape, symbols, scratches, marks on clay. Out of those marks came writing, first for trade, then for story, then for law. The first scripts would emerge in Mesopotamia, but the idea was already germinating in the minds of farmers, the need to preserve time. To settle was to resist forgetting. The world's first villages were memory made visible. Every stone, every pot, every ritual was a sentence in humanity's first written paragraph. The landscape itself became the earliest library. What began as a survival strategy became the architecture of meaning. The earth that once dictated our movements now answered to us. Fields replaced forests, temples replaced caves, gods replaced the wind. And though we did not yet know it, the first walls we built around our homes were also the first walls we built around our minds. Civilization was no longer a question of whether we could endure, but how we would choose to live together, and what we were willing to sacrifice for that security. The story of humanity's rise is not a straight line of progress. It's a series of negotiations between freedom and belonging, chaos and order, hunger and hope. At the dawn of settlement, every seed planted was a decision to believe in tomorrow. The earth was no longer a stranger, it was home. And in that home, humanity finally learned what it meant to build, not just for survival, but for legacy. Before the pyramids, before the philosophers of Greece, or the kings of Rome, there was a river, actually two, the Tigris and the Euphrates, winding like twin veins through the heart of what would one day be called Mesopotamia, the land between rivers. It was here, 6,000 years ago, that humanity first transformed survival into civilization. The floods of these rivers were unpredictable, sometimes gentle, sometimes catastrophic, but within their chaos lay promise. Each season they spilled silt across the plains, dark and rich as blood. From this fertile soil grew more than wheat and barley. It grew the first cities, the first gods, the first recorded dreams of human order. In the shadow of these waters, the world's earliest known city rose, Uruk. It began as a cluster of huts and granaries, but its growth was unstoppable. Clay walls expanded outward, enclosing temples, workshops, and homes. The city became a living organism, fed by labor, pulsing with commerce, dreaming in the smoke of its altars. For the first time in history, people lived by the tens of thousands. They built not because they had to, but because they believed in something greater. An idea, a structure of meaning called civilization. Uruk was the beginning of urban life, but also of bureaucracy. Crops were counted, taxes collected, goods traded. The world needed records, and so the first great invention of humanity was born, writing. It began humbly. Accountants pressed reed styluses into wet clay to record grain rations and debts. These impressions evolved into symbols, pictographs, then cuneiform. Over centuries, writing leapt from commerce to culture. A merchant's ledger became a priest's hymn, and the written word became humanity's mirror. For the first time, memory could outlive its maker. One of those memories would become the world's first epic, the Epic of Gilgamesh. It told of a king who ruled Uruk with strength and arrogance, who sought immortality and found only the truth of mortality. Written on clay tablets 4,000 years before Homer, it asked the same questions we still ask today. What does it mean to be human? What is the worth of a life? But Uruk was not alone. The land between rivers filled with rival city-states, Uruk calls Kish, Eridu, each was a kingdom unto itself, ruled by priests or kings who claimed divine favor. Each built its own temples, its own gods, its own myths. Religion was everywhere, woven into the fabric of existence. The people saw divinity in every force of nature, the storm, the flood, the harvest. Their gods were not abstract or distant. They were powerful, temperamental, hungry. Temples were built as cosmic junctions, places where heaven and earth could touch. At the heart of every city stood the ziggurat, a mountain of mud bricks stacked toward the sky. It was both shrine and symbol, a stairway for the gods, a declaration that humanity had learned to build the sacred from the soil. Each brick carried not just weight but belief, that the world could be ordered, that chaos could be contained. And yet, order demanded hierarchy. Priests interpreted the god's will, kings enforced it, and laborers obeyed it. The same rivers that gave life also defined power. Whoever controlled the canals, controlled the people. To manage water was to rule. Mesopotamian engineers built complex irrigation systems, dividing the floods into channels that reached every field. But this mastery came with tension. One city's canal was another's lifeline. Disputes over water often became wars. From those conflicts emerged the law. The most famous of these early codes came from Hammurabi, king of Babylon, who ruled around 1750 BCE. His laws were carved into stone for all to see, a black basalt stele standing nearly 7 feet tall, etched with 282 decrees. They covered everything from theft to marriage to debt, and carried a single guiding principle: justice as balance. If a man puts out the eye of another man, his eye shall be put out. It was brutal, yes, but revolutionary. For the first time, justice belonged not to the whim of the ruler, but to a written standard. The law was no longer a whisper of power. It was a text, eternal and unblinking. Under Hammurabi, Babylon flourished. Temples rose, gardens bloomed, mathematics and astronomy advanced. The Babylonians charted the stars, dividing time itself, inventing the 60-minute hour, the 360-degree circle. To them, the heavens were not mystery, but map. They read the sky as one might read a sacred book, believing that every movement of the planets was a message from the divine. Meanwhile, commerce tied everything together. Mesopotamian traders traveled by river and caravan, exchanging grain for metals, cloth for spices. They carried their tablets of cuneiform, their seals of baked clay, the first passports of the ancient world. From their hands, trade became the nervous system of civilization. And yet, beneath the splendor, there was fragility. The land between rivers was fertile but fickle. One failed flood, one season of drought, could undo centuries of prosperity. City-states rose and fell like the tides. Dynasties ended as suddenly as they began. The Sumerians gave way to the Akkadians to the Babylonians, the Babylonians to the Assyrians, each building atop the bones of the last, each convinced they had achieved permanence, each proven wrong. Empires expanded and crumbled, their gods replaced, their languages eroded, but something always survived: the clay tablets. In their baked permanence, they carried the voice of the earliest human thought. When archaeologists unearthed them millennia later, they found not the babble of primitive minds, but the architecture of civilization itself: law, poetry, astronomy, music, and mathematics. Mesopotamia's gift to humanity was not its monuments or its kings. It was the idea that the world could be understood, that chaos could be shaped into pattern, and pattern recorded into language. It was here that humanity took its first collective breath as a species of builders, dreamers, and thinkers. The same urge that shaped the first irrigation canals would later carve marble into cathedrals and circuits into silicon. The people of Mesopotamia could never have imagined how far their inventions would travel, that their writing would become the root of alphabets, their measurements, the rhythm of time, their stories the ancestors of every myth told after. And though their empires turned to dust, their legacy endures in every contract signed, every map drawn, every law debated, every poem written to outlast its author. The rivers still run, not of water now, but of memory, and in their current, you can still hear the echo of the first voices that dared to speak to the world and to write it down. When the sun rose over the Nile, it rose on the most enduring dream humanity ever built, a civilization not of conquest or chance, but of rhythm. Egypt was not born from chaos. It was born from the flood, a miracle that came every year like breath itself. While the rest of the world feared the unpredictable fury of nature, Egypt lived by its predictability. The river rose, the river fell, and in that divine order the Egyptians saw the face of eternity. The Nile was not just water, it was the spine of life. It flowed north from the heart of Africa to the Mediterranean, carrying with it black silt that nourished the valley. On its banks, reeds whispered in the wind, crocodiles slept in the shallows, and farmers carved furrows into the wet soil with wooden plows. From that soil came abundance: wheat, barley, flax, enough not just to feed a people, but to sustain a kingdom for 3,000 years. To the Egyptians, the flood was a covenant with the gods, proof that the universe itself could be trusted. Where Mesopotamia saw their rivers as angry gods to be appeased, Egypt saw the Nile as a parent, generous, patient, eternal. And from that faith came stability. While other ancient worlds rose and fell in cycles of violence, Egypt endured. Its people didn't build to survive. They built to last forever. They called their land Kemet, the Black Earth, a name born from the color of its fertile soil. And they called their ruler Pharaoh the living bridge between heaven and earth. He was not simply a king. He was a god in flesh, a being whose heartbeat mirrored the sun's journey across the sky. The first pharaohs of the early dynastic period bound the scattered villages of the Nile into one realm. In their hands, a collection of farmers became a nation. They created bureaucracy before the word existed. Scribes with ink-stained fingers tracking harvests, craftsmen shaping symbols of divine power, priests interpreting the will of the gods. And above them all stood Maat, the Egyptian concept of cosmic balance, truth, and justice. Maat was not just law, it was existence itself. Every act, from the ruling of empires to the planting of seeds, had to serve balance. Disorder, Isfet, was the greatest sin. The pharaoh's purpose was to keep the world in harmony, to ensure that the sun rose each day, that the river flooded, that the stars did not fall from their courses. It was from this spiritual geometry that Egypt's grandeur was born. In the desert beyond the Nile's green edges, the Egyptians raised monuments that defied time. The pyramids were not built as symbols of wealth or conquest. They were engines of eternity. Each one was a stairway to the heavens, constructed not for the living but for the dead. The oldest of them all, the Great Pyramid of Khufu at Giza, rose higher than any structure on Earth for nearly 4,000 years. Its base aligned perfectly with the stars, its stones, some weighing over 70 tons, carved and placed with impossible precision. The builders did not see themselves as slaves to a tyrant, but as servants of a god, laboring not for gold but for immortality. For the Egyptians, death was not an ending, it was an extension. The soul, the care, left the body, but required sustenance. That is why tombs were filled with food, wine, and ornaments, and why the art on their walls depicted the afterlife in vivid detail. Fields of green, rivers of peace, the eternal companionship of loved ones. They believed the soul would face judgment before Osiris, god of the dead. The heart would be weighed against a feather, the feather of Ma'at. If the heart was light, the soul entered paradise. If heavy with sin, it was devoured by Ammit, the devourer of the damned. No empire before or since had built itself so completely on the idea that morality, not power, was the key to eternity. Every part of Egyptian life reflected this balance. Farmers worked by the calendar of the flood, craftsmen by the measure of the stars. Time itself was circular, a cycle of renewal rather than decay. Even the gods mirrored this rhythm. Ra, the sun god, was born at dawn, died at dusk, and was reborn each morning. Their art, too, was an expression of permanence. Egyptian painters and sculptors did not seek novelty. They sought timelessness. Every line, every proportion, followed divine rules passed down from the first dynasties. To change the art was to disrupt Ma'at. And so, for millennia, Egyptian statues stood still, their faces calm, their gazes fixed beyond the present. Yet, for all its order, Egypt was never static. Beneath the timeless veneer, dynasties rose and fell like the breath of the Nile. Power moved between north and south, between Thebes and Memphis, between stability and collapse. But always, the idea of Egypt survived. Even in chaos, the people believed the world would return to balance, that Ma'at would be restored. Some rulers were warriors, like Thutmose III, who expanded Egypt's borders into Canaan and Nubia, bringing back wealth and tribute. Others were visionaries, like Hatshepsut, the woman who declared herself pharaoh and ruled with wisdom, building temples that rivaled the pyramids in grandeur. And then came Akhenaten, the heretic king who dared to challenge the old order, closing temples and proclaiming a single god, Akhenan, the sun disk. For a brief moment, Egypt flirted with monotheism, but after his death, the priests of Amun erased his name from the walls, restoring the old gods and the old balance. Through all of this, the Egyptian imagination remained vast. They were astronomers and engineers, healers and mathematicians. They mapped the heavens with precision, developing a 365-day calendar based on the rising of Sirius, the star that heralded the flood. They practiced surgery, recorded anatomy, understood irrigation and architecture on a scale unseen elsewhere. Their medicine was part science, part prayer, a reflection of their belief that the divine resided in every natural order. And though the centuries would bring conquerors, Hyksos invaders, Assyrians, Persians, Greeks, none could erase the Egyptian soul. Even when foreign kings sat on the throne, they wore the crowns of the pharaohs, built temples in the Egyptian style, and prayed to Egyptian gods. The conquerors became converts to eternity. When the last native pharaoh fell, and the sands began to swallow the temples, Egypt did not die. Its language, its architecture, its myths seeped into the veins of every civilization that followed. The Greek concept of the soul, the Christian idea of judgment, the very geometry of time itself, all bear the fingerprints of the Nile. Egypt did not merely live in history, it invented the idea of history, the belief that what is written, what is carved, what is remembered, can defy oblivion. And though its monuments now stand weathered and silent, they still do what they were built to do, remind the living that eternity is possible, that order, beauty, and belief can outlast the flesh that dreamed them. When you look at the pyramids, you are not just seeing stones, you are seeing the first successful attempt by humanity to turn faith into architecture, to build a bridge from the temporary to the eternal, and to cross it with nothing but conviction. Long before the roar of Rome, or the philosophy of Greece, before the Great Wall, before even the rise of Egypt's final pyramids, another civilization flourished quietly along the banks of a different river, vast, intricate, and strangely silent. It left no kings, no conquerors, no boastful inscriptions, only cities, vast, ordered, precise, and mysterious. This was the Indus Valley civilization, born more than 5,000 years ago, in what is now Pakistan and northwestern India, along the great rivers, Indus and Sarasvati. Its people called their cities something else, names now lost to time. Archaeologists would name them Harappa and Mohenjo-daro, and together they would rewrite what it meant to be civilized. The first thing that strikes anyone who studies the Indus world is not its monuments, but its logic. These were not haphazard settlements. Every street ran straight, crossing at perfect right angles. The cities were built on raised platforms to resist floods. They had drainage systems more advanced than many cities of Europe 4,000 years later, covered sewers, inspection chambers, and even private bathrooms connected to a central waste network. In every house, water flowed, waste was removed, and cleanliness was law. It was as if the entire civilization had been planned by one mind. No palaces dominate the skyline. No temples tower over the poor. Instead, the layout suggests an extraordinary sense of order and equality. Each brick, each street, each home seems to whisper the same quiet truth. Here, civilization meant balance. Mohenjo-daro, the mound of the dead, stood at its heart. A city of some 40,000 people, surrounded by fertile floodplains. At its center stood the Great Bath, a massive sunken pool built of waterproofed brick. Steps led down from all sides, suggesting not pleasure, but ritual. Water, the giver of life, was treated as sacred. Here, perhaps, people gathered to cleanse themselves before ceremony or council. Nearby, granaries lined the streets, enormous storehouses for surplus grain. They spoke of abundance, of efficiency, of a people who had mastered the rhythm of planting and flood. Each city had weights and measures, standardized across vast distances. Trade goods bore seals pressed with the marks of animals, bulls, elephants, unicorn-like creatures, carved in exquisite miniature. These seals have been found not just across India, but as far west as Mesopotamia. The Indus people were part of a global network, long before globalization had a name, but their voice, the script etched beside those seals, remains unreadable. Thousands of inscriptions, carved into stone and clay, survive. Each is composed of tiny pictographs, fish, birds, jars, lines, too brief to translate, too consistent to dismiss. Linguists have spent generations trying to unlock the code. Some say it is an early form of Dravidian, others, a lost tongue unrelated to any known language. Whatever it was, it died when the civilization did, leaving behind the most haunting silence in history, a culture that spoke across half a continent, but whose words have turned to dust. That silence is what sets the Indus Valley apart. Where Egypt shouted its divinity in hieroglyphs and Mesopotamia recorded its kings on clay, the Indus left no hymns, no conquests, no names. Not a single ruler is known. No statue of a pharaoh, no inscription of a victory. This anonymity is not ignorance. It is identity. Some scholars believe power in the Indus cities was collective, not royal. There were no vast tombs, no golden coffins, no palaces atop ziggurats. Leadership may have been civic or spiritual, shared among councils or elders. If true, then the Indus people achieved something humanity rarely sustains: prosperity without tyranny, order without empire. Their trade stretched far: copper from Rajasthan, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, shells from the Arabian Sea. They were artisans, traders, farmers, engineers. In workshops, craftsmen shaped beads of carnelian, so fine that modern jewelers still marvel at their precision. They spun cotton, perhaps the first in the world to do so, and wove it into fabric for distant markets. In their homes, they kept small idols, perhaps gods or ancestors, though none large enough to dominate. Their religion, like their architecture, seems communal, intimate, quietly spiritual. And then, almost as suddenly as it appeared, this great civilization began to fade. Around 1900 BCE, the rivers shifted course. The once mighty Sarasvati dried into sand, and with it, the agricultural heart of the Indus world began to collapse. Fields turned barren, trade faltered, and people drifted eastward into the plains of the Ganges. The great cities were abandoned, their bricks carried away by wind and time. It wasn't invasion, no mass graves, no signs of conquest. It was something slower, more tragic. The betrayal of the climate. Nature had been their partner, their foundation, and when that balance broke, so did their world. The descendants of the Indus people did not vanish entirely. They carried their traditions into new lands, new rivers, new rituals. In the Vedic hymns that later arose in India, faint echoes of that older order remain: reverence for water, for cattle, for the cycles of fire and rain. The Indus Valley did not die. It transformed, absorbed into the next great wave of human culture. For centuries, the world forgot it existed. Its ruins lay buried beneath dust, until 1922, when archaeologists first uncovered the streets of Harappa. What they found was not a ruin of savagery, but of sophistication. They brushed sand from the baked bricks, and realized they were standing in one of humanity's earliest true civilizations, as ancient to the Greeks as the Greeks are to us. And yet, the mystery remains. Who ruled these people? What did they believe? What words did they speak? We know their cities, their craft, their engineering, but not their story. The Indus Valley is history's great enigma, a civilization that built perfection, then vanished without a trace of vanity. Perhaps that is its lesson, that greatness does not always announce itself in marble or war, but in quiet harmony, in the invisible thread of cooperation that binds people together. In a world obsessed with monuments, the Indus cities remind us that the truest measure of civilization is not what survives in stone, but what survives in spirit. When the monsoon winds blow across the plains of Sindh, they still whisper through the buried streets of Mohenjo-daro. The wells are dry now, the baths filled with dust, the drains silent. But if you stand among the ruins, you can still feel the order beneath your feet, the rhythm of lives lived in balance, of hands that built for beauty, not glory. And perhaps that is the closest thing to immortality humanity can ever achieve, not to be remembered by name, but to have created something so harmonious that even in silence, it still speaks. On the far side of the Asian continent, beyond the mountains of Tibet and the endless steppes, another river carried the weight of destiny. It was not gentle like the Nile, nor temperamental like the Tigris. It was fierce, golden, unpredictable, the Huanghe, the Yellow River, known to generations as both China's sorrow and its cradle. Out of its muddy floodplains emerged one of the longest continuous civilizations on Earth, a world where kings were myth and myth became law. The earliest Chinese communities rose more than 4,000 years ago, Farmers built their villages along the river's edges, digging ditches to tame the floods, and planting millet in the lost soil. These were small, tight-knit communities at first, their walls made of packed earth, their lives bound by the rhythm of season and survival. But the seeds of something vast were already taking root. The idea that order could mirror the cosmos, that human society was a reflection of heaven itself. From that belief grew the Xie dynasty, shrouded in both legend and archaeology. The chronicles speak of Yu the Great, the man who tamed the floods. He labored for years, carving canals and guiding the waters back to the sea. He did not fight the river, he learned to work with it. When the floods were controlled, the land prospered, and the people hailed him not as a conqueror, but as a savior. His reward was not gold or glory, but the right to rule. Thus was born the mandate of heaven, the belief that power came not from might or inheritance, but from moral harmony with the universe. It was a radical idea that legitimacy was conditional, that heaven could withdraw its favor from a corrupt ruler just as easily as it bestowed it upon a virtuous one. Unlike the divine kings of Egypt, the rulers of China were never gods. They were caretakers, bound to a moral code that stretched beyond their own lifetimes. When they failed to uphold it, when floods returned, when crops died, when the people suffered, it was a sign that heaven had turned its face away. Revolt was not rebellion, it was restoration. This doctrine would echo through every dynasty that followed: Shang, Shu, Qin, Han, Tang, Ming, shaping China's political and spiritual DNA for millennia. It turned history into a cycle: rise, virtue, corruption, collapse, renewal. In that cycle, China found not despair, but endurance. The Shang dynasty, which followed the Xie, left the first concrete traces of organized power. Their cities were fortified with massive earthen walls, their artisans worked bronze with unmatched mastery. But their most remarkable legacy lies in the fragments of bone and shell unearthed centuries later, oracle bones, etched with questions to the gods, and then scorched by fire to read the cracks. These were the earliest Chinese writings. Will the harvest be good? One inscription asks. Will the child survive? Another pleads. These were not myths or laws, but human voices, anxious, reverent, seeking pattern in chaos. Through them we see the birth of Chinese script, a language that never broke, evolving but never dying. Every character still written today carries within it the shadow of those cracked bones, each stroke an echo of ancient hands asking heaven to listen. The Shang kings ruled through divination and ritual, their palaces thick with incense and blood. They believed the ancestors watched and intervened in mortal affairs, and so they built altars, performed sacrifices, and recorded each act on bronze vessels cast with prayers. Their gods were many, but above them all stood Shangdi, the High Lord of Heaven, distant, moral, absolute. And yet, it was not religion that made the Shang enduring. It was their sense of continuity. They believed time was not linear, but cyclical, a pattern repeating endlessly, the past alive within the present. Every dynasty that followed inherited this rhythm: reverence for the ancestors, respect for ritual, and the conviction that harmony was the highest form of wisdom. When the Shang fell to the Zhou dynasty, around 1046 BCE, the conquerors did not destroy their legacy. They absorbed it, refined it, and made it philosophy. The Zhou rulers declared that the Shang had lost the mandate of heaven through corruption, and that heaven had chosen new stewards. In doing so, they created a political principle that would legitimize rulers for 3,000 years. Under the Zhou, China became not just a kingdom, but a cosmos of ideas. The Book of Songs recorded poetry and folk tales. The Book of Rites codified social conduct. The I Ching, the Book of Changes, mapped the universe through symbols of balance and transformation. This was the birth of a worldview that saw the world not as a struggle of good and evil, but as a dance of opposites, yin and yang, shadow and light, stillness and motion. Philosophy, rather than conquest, became China's enduring art. Centuries later, in the chaos of the warring states, two great minds would rise, Confucius and Laozi, their ideas destined to define the soul of the nation. Confucius saw civilization as a moral fabric held together by virtue, respect, and duty. A ruler, he said, should govern not by force but by example. A family should mirror the harmony of heaven, with the father as the moral compass and the son as the loyal heir. The world could be perfected if every man perfected himself. Laozi, the quiet sage of the Tao, disagreed. To him, order was not imposed. It flowed naturally from the Tao, the way. The more laws humanity created, the further it strayed from balance. True wisdom lay in simplicity, in yielding, in moving as water moves, gentle but unstoppable. Their philosophies, Confucian discipline and Taoist freedom, became the twin pillars of Chinese thought. One taught duty, the other transcendence. Together they offered a map of existence that still shapes the world's largest civilization. While these ideas flourished, the material world followed suit. Bronze weapons gave way to iron, small fiefdoms grew into vast bureaucracies, roads, canals, and armies unified what had once been a patchwork of tribes. Each dynasty built upon the bones of the last, always claiming heaven's favor, always fearing its loss. It was a civilization obsessed with continuity, not change. Yet its endurance became its greatest innovation. Where others sought immortality in monuments, China found it in memory. Each emperor honored the past. Each scholar copied the old texts by hand. Each ritual repeated what had been done before. The future was never a rupture, but a reflection. And perhaps that is why, while other empires fell into ruin, China persisted. The mandate of heaven was not a superstition. It was a survival mechanism, a moral compass in the endless storm of history. When we look back now across the millennia, we see not a static culture, but a river of thought, wide, deep, patient. The same river that carried the first farmers still flows through the cities of glass and steel today. Its floods are now metaphors, its mandate now written in constitutions and collective dreams. Civilizations come and go, kingdoms rise, empires collapse. But the Chinese idea, that order is a reflection of cosmic harmony, that leadership is service, that morality and power are inseparable, remains as unbroken as the script carved into bone 4,000 years ago. From the mud of the Yellow River to the stars, charted in modern Beijing, the current has never stopped. The river still flows, and heaven, perhaps, still watches. The story of civilization now drifts westward, past the deserts, past the mountains, until the land opens into light. The sea between continents glitters beneath the sun, ringed by olive groves and jagged coastlines. The ancients called it Mare Nostrum, our sea, but long before Rome claimed it, before Alexander dreamed of empire, it was a patchwork of islands and harbors, each one a world unto itself. The Mediterranean was not a cradle of one people, but of many, each gazing across the same horizon and daring to sail into it. Here, among its waters, humanity discovered something entirely new. The exchange of ideas, trade became conversation, culture became contagion, and civilization learned how to think for itself. It began with Crete, a green island rising from the Aegean, where the Minoans built palaces of such grace and color that their ruins still seem alive. At Knossos, columns painted red and black supported halls filled with frescoes, dolphins swimming through blue seas, acrobats leaping over bulls, priestess clothed in light and serpents. Their art spoke not of war, but of celebration, of joy in life's abundance. The Minoans were sailors, merchants, navigators of the unknown. Their ships, sleek and fast, carried pottery, wine, and olive oil to distant ports. They traded not only goods, but peace, a civilization without fortresses, trusting the sea more than the sword. For nearly 1,000 years, they ruled the waves, and then, as mysteriously as they had risen, they vanished. Some say an earthquake destroyed them, others blame the eruption of Thera, a volcanic island whose explosion sent tsunamis crashing across the Aegean. Whatever the cause, the sea they loved turned against them. From their ashes came another people, the Mycenaeans, fierce and ambitious, living on the Greek mainland. If the Minoans were dreamers, the Mycenaeans were doers. They built citadels of stone, walled cities crowned with golden tombs. At Mycenaean Tiryns, massive blocks were piled into gateways that seemed made for giants. They were the heirs of myth, the world of Agamemnon and Helen, Achilles and Odysseus, a world later remembered through the music of Homer's verses. But these were not yet Greeks as we know them. They spoke early dialects, worshipped unfamiliar gods, and lived by the sword. Trade routes carried them to Asia Minor and the islands of the Aegean, where they encountered new ideas, writing from the East, metallurgy from Anatolia, stories from Egypt. They absorbed, adapted, transformed. And then, around 1200 BCE, the world of bronze collapsed. Across the Mediterranean, kingdoms fell like dominoes. Troy burned, Mycenae crumbled, Egypt nearly broke. Trade vanished, cities emptied, writing disappeared. For centuries, darkness covered the sea, a silence so deep that even memory almost died. But silence, as history teaches, is fertile. Out of that dark age, something extraordinary began to stir, not a new empire, but a new mind. By the 8th century BCE, small communities had begun to rise again on the rocky coasts and islands of Greece. They called their settlements polis, city-states, and each was fiercely independent, united only by language and myth. There was Athens, Sparta, Corinth, Thebes, each a different answer to the same question: how should humans live together? The Greeks were surrounded by ruins, the remnants of Mycenaean fortresses and Minoan palaces. They knew they were the children of something ancient, and yet they refused to simply inherit the past. They questioned it, they argued, they invented reason as an act of rebellion. In the agora, the public square, citizens gathered not to obey a king, but to debate ideas. Words became weapons sharper than any sword. They argued about law, virtue, the nature of the soul, the shape of the universe. For the first time, thought itself became public property. From this crucible of argument came democracy, fragile, imperfect, revolutionary. In Athens, every free man, never women or slaves, not yet could speak and vote on laws. It was chaos disguised as order, a system powered by rhetoric and passion. The idea was simple but seismic, that power could be shared, that the wisdom of many could balance the will of one. Meanwhile, across the Peloponnesus, Sparta offered a darker mirror, a city built not on philosophy, but discipline. Its citizens were soldiers from birth, their lives devoted to the state. Luxury was banned, curiosity discouraged. Yet, even in its rigidity, Sparta embodied another truth of the Mediterranean world, that civilization is never one shape. It is a dialogue between opposites, freedom and order, beauty and strength. The Greeks turned conflict into art. They fought wars, yes, endless ones, but they also fought with words, with theater, with architecture. In their tragedies, playwrights like Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides dissected the human condition, hubris, love, betrayal, the inexorable justice of the gods. Their comedies mocked power, their sculptures captured motion, their temples embodied harmony. And above them all, on a hill in Athens, rose the Parthenon, dedicated to Athena, goddess of wisdom and war. It was not just a temple, it was a statement. Its columns measured perfection, its proportions a kind of mathematics made visible. Here art and reason were one. But this awakening was not confined to Greece. Across the sea, another people was shaping their destiny, the Phoenicians, masters of navigation and trade. From their ports at Tyre and Sidon, they sailed farther than any before, carrying purple dye, glass, and cedar wood to every coast. They left behind something far more precious than goods, the alphabet, 22 symbols that captured the sounds of speech, simple, efficient, revolutionary. The Greeks adopted it, added vowels, and from it came the letters you're reading now. Ideas now traveled faster than armies. Trade carried language, and language carried philosophy. The Mediterranean had become a network of minds, each city-state a spark in a growing constellation. Then came the Persians, vast, disciplined, a civilization of kings and satraps that stretched from Egypt to India. To them, Greece was a minor frontier. But when Darius and Xerxes sent their armies west, the Greeks stood together, a rare unity forged in desperation. At Marathon, a small Athenian army shattered a force 3 times its size. At Thermopylae, 300 Spartans held a mountain pass against a tide of invaders. At Salamis, Athenian ships rammed the Persian fleet and sent it to the depths. The victories were miraculous, proof to the Greeks that freedom could defeat tyranny, that human will could defy destiny. In the aftermath, Greece entered its golden age. Philosophy, science, art, politics, all flourished at once. Socrates walked barefoot through the streets, asking questions that unsettled kings. Plato built an academy of thought. Aristotle dissected the natural world, laying the foundations of logic and biology. This was the first true awakening of the human mind, a civilization daring to explain itself without appealing to gods or fate. They sought reason in the stars, geometry in the earth, proportion in the body, justice in the heart. And yet, even this brilliance carried seeds of decay. The same pride that built Athens' empire led it into ruinous wars with its neighbors. The Peloponnesian War drained the Greek world of its energy, leaving it fractured and vulnerable. But before it faded, it accomplished something no other civilization had done. It turned thought itself into an inheritance. The ideas born in its markets and temples would one day outlive its ruins, carried by new conquerors, translated into new tongues, echoing through new empires. For the Greeks had discovered a truth that would never die, that the human mind is itself a kind of sea, vast, restless, and ungovernable, forever reaching for the horizon. Out of the arid plateaus of Iran, between deserts and mountains, a new power emerged, vast, tolerant, and disciplined. Where the Greeks had built ideas, the Persians built infrastructure. Where others ruled through fear, they ruled through organization. If Mesopotamia had invented civilization, and Egypt had immortalized it, Persia would unify it. The first Persian Empire was not born in conquest but in vision, the vision of a single ruler, Cyrus the Great. He came to power in the 6th century BCE, rising from the rugged lands of Anshan. Unlike most conquerors, Cyrus did not burn what he conquered, he rebuilt it. When he captured Babylon in 539 BCE, he entered not as a destroyer, but as a liberator. The city's priests greeted him as the chosen of their god, Marduk. He freed enslaved peoples, restored temples, and allowed exiles to return home. among them the Jews, who would later remember him in their scriptures as the Lord's anointed. Cyrus's empire stretched from the Aegean Sea to the Indus River, from the Caucasus to the deserts of Arabia, the largest the world had ever seen. But its strength was not its armies, it was its administration. The Persians built roads that spanned thousands of kilometers, connecting cities, ports, and provinces. The most famous, the Royal Road, ran from Sardis to Susa, lined with rest stations and patrols. Couriers rode it in relay, carrying messages across the empire in a matter of days. Neither snow, nor rain, nor heat, nor darkness of night, wrote Herodotus, stays these couriers from their appointed course. Those words would one day inspire the motto of modern postal services, an echo of Persian efficiency across millennia. Cyrus founded the empire, but his successors gave it shape. Darius I, known as Darius the Great, organized it into provinces called satrapies, each governed by a satrap who answered directly to the king. Gold and silver coinage standardized trade, taxation became predictable, roads connected every region to the capital. His engineers built canals linking the Nile to the Red Sea, bridging continents long before the Suez Canal. He carved his laws into stone, not as decrees of terror, but as statements of principle. By the grace of Ahura Mazda, his inscriptions read, "I am just, I punish the liar and reward the truthful." At Persepolis, the ceremonial heart of the empire, Darius built something the world had never seen, a palace of nations. Its stairways were carved with scenes of tribute bearers from every corner of his dominion. Ethiopians with ivory, Indians with gold, Lydians with fine cloth, Greeks with silver vessels. Each figure was distinct yet dignified, not conquered slaves, but participants in an ordered world. For the first time in history, empire was not merely domination, it was administration as art. Persian civilization revolved around a central moral code drawn from Zoroastrianism, one of the world's oldest monotheistic faiths. The prophet Zarathustra had taught that existence was a struggle between the truth and darkness. Humanity's duty was to choose rightly, to live by good thoughts, good words, good deeds. Kings were judged not by conquest, but by righteousness. This belief infused Persian governance with an unusual restraint. Tolerance was policy, not weakness. Temples, languages, and customs were respected throughout the empire, so long as they did not challenge imperial order. But greatness, even enlightened, is never immune to pride. Darius's son Xerxes inherited the world and sought to expand it still further. His invasion of Greece would become legend, the march of 1,000,000 men across the Hellespont, on floating bridges of boats, the endless columns of soldiers, chariots, elephants, and engineers. At the Thermopylae, he met 300 Spartans who defied him to the last. Though Xerxes won the pass, his fleet would later be destroyed at Salamis, undone by the cunning of smaller, faster Greek ships. It was the first sign that even an empire of continents could be humbled by a handful of islands. After Xerxes, the empire endured but began to fracture. Bureaucracy hardened into corruption. Satraps grew powerful and independent. The royal court became a labyrinth of intrigue, its kings insulated by ceremony. For 2 centuries, Persia remained vast, but it had lost its edge, the moral balance that had once justified its rule. And then from the west came a storm unlike any the world had seen. In 334 BCE, a young Macedonian king crossed the Hellespont with a small army and an impossible dream. His name was Alexander. He was 22 years old, heir to a rugged kingdom at the edge of the Greek world, trained by Aristotle himself, and convinced that destiny had chosen him to unite East and West. Alexander's conquest of Persia was not a campaign, it was a phenomenon. He moved like lightning, his army a living instrument of speed and discipline. At Granicus, he shattered the first Persian defense. At Issus, he broke the heart of Darius III's forces. And at Gaugamela, he annihilated an army 5 times his size. When Darius fled, Alexander pursued him across the empire, through deserts and mountains, until the Persian king was murdered by his own men. Standing over his fallen rival, Alexander wept. He did not see an enemy, he saw a mirror. Rather than destroy Persia, he claimed it. He wore its robes, adopted its customs, and married its princess. At Persepolis, he burned the great palace, some say in drunken revenge, others as a symbolic gesture of renewal. Then he regretted it. The fire that consumed Persepolis was the same fire that consumed Alexander, the fever of ambition. From Babylon, he marched east, to Bactria, to Sogdiana, to the edge of India. His armies crossed mountains where the snow never melted, and jungles where the rivers boiled. They fought kings who commanded elephants, and warriors who had never heard the name of Greece. At last, on the banks of the Hyphasis River, his soldiers refused to go further. They had reached the end of the world. Alexander relented. He turned back toward Babylon, now the capital of his new world. There, in 323 BCE, at the age of 32, the conqueror who had redrawn the map of civilization fell ill and died, perhaps of fever, perhaps of poison. His empire collapsed within a generation, torn apart by his generals. But his dream, the fusion of East and West, endured. In the cities he founded, Greek and Persian cultures interwove. Hellenistic science, art, and philosophy spread from Alexandria in Egypt to the mountains of Afghanistan. Scholars translated Babylonian astronomy into Greek, Egyptian medicine into text, Indian thought into conversation. It was the first true globalization of the human spirit. The Persian Empire had shown the world how to rule. Alexander's conquests showed the world how ideas could travel faster than armies. One built the infrastructure of civilization, the other gave it momentum. Between them, they turned the ancient world into a single stage, a world no longer divided by isolation, but bound together by the restless imagination of empire. When Alexander died, his body was said to be placed in a golden sarcophagus and borne to Egypt. There, in the city that bore his name, the conqueror who sought to be divine became dust. Yet his shadow remained, stretching across continents, across centuries, as a reminder that every empire, no matter how vast, begins with a single idea that the world can be made whole. In the heart of the Italian peninsula, among 7 small hills beside a slow, winding river, shepherds built a village of mud huts. There was nothing remarkable about it, no ancient palaces, no monumental temples, only a few scattered tribes bound by kinship and war. Yet from that small settlement, a civilization would rise that would one day command the known world. Rome began not in glory, but in struggle. Legend says it was founded by Romulus, a child abandoned on the banks of the Tiber and suckled by a she-wolf. When he grew to manhood, he slew his brother Remus and marked the boundaries of a new city. That myth, violent, sacred, and defiant, became the soul of Rome. It taught every Roman that their city was born of will, not grace. By the 8th century BCE, the early Romans were a mix of tribes, Latins, Sabines, and Etruscans. From the Etruscans they learned the crafts of stone and metal, the art of city building, the ceremony of kingship. But monarchy, to the Roman mind, was a wound that never healed. When their last king, Tarquinius Superbus, was overthrown in 509 BCE, Rome swore never again to bow to a single man. They created something the world had never seen before, a republic, The Roman Republic was not a democracy in the Greek sense. It was a machine of balance and ambition. Power was divided between the Senate, the Council of Elders, and two annually elected consuls who shared authority. Every office had its rival, every decision its counterweight. It was government built on mistrust, the belief that no man should be trusted with too much power for too long. And yet, through that rivalry, Rome thrived. The Republic expanded slowly, methodically, through alliances and war. Neighboring cities fell not just to Roman swords but to Roman systems. The defeated were offered citizenship, a revolutionary policy that turned enemies into Romans. Conquered peoples became soldiers, engineers, merchants, their loyalty bought not by fear, but by opportunity. The army became Rome's beating heart. Soldiers were not mercenaries, but citizens, sworn to defend the Republic, and the idea it embodied, that the collective will of the people could shape destiny. They built roads as they marched, carving stone paths through forests and mountains, connecting every corner of the peninsula. The saying, "All roads lead to Rome," was not poetry, it was logistics. Each mile of stone extended the reach of Roman order. But the Republic's greatest test came not from within Italy, but from across the sea. From Carthage, the North African city, founded by Phoenician traders. Carthage controlled the western Mediterranean, its fleets unmatched, its coffers overflowing. For over a century, the two powers clashed in a series of brutal conflicts known as the Punic Wars. The first war was for Sicily, the second for survival. In 218 BCE, Carthage sent its greatest general, Hannibal Barca, to strike at the heart of Rome. With an army of mercenaries and war elephants, he crossed the Alps in winter, an impossible feat, and descended into Italy.
Yeah, like a force of nature.
At Cannae, he annihilated an entire Roman army. Yet Rome refused to surrender. It raised new legions, fought new battles, and learned from every defeat. Years later, on Carthage's own soil, the Roman general Scipio Africanus crushed Hannibal at Zama, ending Carthage's power forever. From that victory, Rome emerged transformed, no longer a republic of farmers, but a military juggernaut. The wealth of conquest poured in, slaves, silver, grain, and ideas. But with wealth came corruption. Senators schemed, generals grew ambitious, and the delicate balance of the Republic began to tilt. It was Gaius Julius Caesar who would tip it over. Caesar was everything Rome, both admired and feared, brilliant, eloquent, ruthless, charismatic. He conquered Gaul in a campaign of staggering speed, crossing mountains and rivers to bring half of Europe under Roman rule. His dispatches, the Commentari de Bello Gallico, made him a legend even before he returned home. But when the Senate ordered him to disband his army, Caesar faced a choice: obedience or destiny. In 49 BCE, he made his decision. He crossed the Rubicon River with his legions, declaring, "The die is cast." It was treason, and it was irreversible. The civil war that followed tore the Republic apart. Caesar triumphed, marched into Rome as dictator, and began to remake the state in his image. He was a paradox, both reformer and autocrat. He rebuilt the calendar, restructured debts, and expanded citizenship. But his power frightened the Senate, and in 44 BCE, on the Ides of March, the conspirators struck. As he fell beneath their daggers, Caesar covered his face with his toga, unwilling to let his killers see him die. They thought they had saved the Republic. Instead, they had buried it. The vacuum left by Caesar's death unleashed another generation of ambition. Octavian, his adopted heir, outmaneuvered his rivals with cold precision. At Actium, he defeated Mark Antony and Cleopatra, the last queen of Egypt. The Republic's last flicker of resistance died with them. In 27 BCE, Octavian became Augustus, Rome's first emperor. The Republic was gone, but its forms remained. The Senate still met, laws were still passed. Only now, one man held all authority. Rome had reinvented monarchy under another name. Under Augustus, the empire entered its golden age, the Pax Romana, the Roman peace. Roads stretched from Spain to Syria. Aqueducts carried water into cities of marble, and legions guarded the borders of a world that felt eternal. The Colosseum, the Pantheon, and the Forum stood as symbols of that new world order, concrete and marble, made myth. Citizens bathed in public baths, read poetry in amphitheaters, and cheered gladiators in the arenas. Latin became the language of power, its words shaping law and literature for millennia to come. Virgil wrote the Aeneid, the national epic of Rome, blending myth and destiny. To rule the nations with law, to spare the conquered, and to subdue the proud. Yet beneath the grandeur, the old contradictions remained. The empire's peace was built on conquest, its prosperity on slavery. Legions patrolled the frontiers, but corruption eroded the heart. Emperors rose and fell, some wise, some monstrous. There was Nero, who burned his own city and sang while it burned. Caligula, who made his horse a senator. Trajan, who expanded the empire to its greatest extent. And Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher king, who ruled with reason, even as plague and war consumed his reign. Rome's genius was its adaptability, its ability to absorb the gods, art, and customs of every people it conquered. But its tragedy was the same as its gift. It absorbed everything except humility. As wealth grew, so did decadence. Bread and circuses replaced civic virtue. The people no longer cared who ruled, only that the games continued. Still, for nearly 5 centuries, Rome held the world in its grip. Its legions built walls in Britain, planted vineyards in Gaul, and founded cities whose ruins still shape modern Europe. The empire's shadow stretched across continents, a monument not only to power, but to organization, to endurance, to the belief that humanity could impose order on the chaos of the world. And yet, no order lasts forever. Beyond the Rhine and the Danube, tribes were stirring, restless, hungry, watching the empire that had once seemed eternal begin to crack. The next chapter of civilization would not be written in marble, but in faith and fire. Rome had conquered the world, but it could not conquer time. Rome ruled the known world, but even the strongest empire cannot command the soul. By the 1st century, its legions had subdued 3 continents, its cities gleamed with marble and gold, and yet the human heart remained restless. Across the empire's provinces, in Judea, Egypt, Syria, and beyond, people searched for meaning in an age of decadence and doubt. The old gods of Olympus felt hollow, their temples grand but empty. Beneath Rome's polished order, the world was quietly waiting for a new idea, one that would not come from palaces or battlefields, but from a carpenter's son in a forgotten corner of the empire. It began in Galilee among fishermen and laborers, under the shadow of Roman occupation. The province of Judea was a land of tension, proud, ancient, and unbroken in its belief in a single God. The Jews had endured Babylon, Persia, Greece, and now Rome, each empire promising peace and delivering chains. In their sacred texts, they carried the prophecy of deliverance, the coming of a Messiah who would free them not only from tyranny, but from sin itself. Into this world walked Jesus of Nazareth, a man with no wealth, no army, and no home, yet whose words would outlast every empire. His message was as simple as it was subversive. The kingdom of God is within you. He healed the sick, ate with outcasts, and taught that love, not law, not lineage, was the true path to divinity. He spoke of forgiveness in a world obsessed with vengeance, of humility in an age of pride. To Rome, he was just another preacher among many. To the local priests, he was a threat. He challenged their authority, overturned their tables, and proclaimed that faith belonged not to temples but to hearts. And so, one spring in Jerusalem, under the procurator Pontius Pilate, he was arrested, tried, and condemned. The empire executed him in the manner it reserved for rebels, nailed to a wooden cross, left to die beneath the scorching sun. His followers scattered in grief, yet within days rumors spread through the city. His tomb was empty. Those who had fled began to return, claiming to have seen him alive. The fisherman Peter, the tax collector Matthew, the zealot Thomas, the persecutor Saul, all became voices of an awakening that could not be contained. Saul of Tarsus, renamed Paul, would carry that message farther than any sword had ever reached. Paul's letters, written to small groups of believers across the empire, became the first Christian texts. They were not proclamations of power, but of faith. There is neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, male nor female, he wrote, for you are all one in Christ. It was a vision of equality that ignored every border Rome had built. Christianity spread not through armies, but through whispers, from market stalls and prisons, along trade routes and city streets. It was carried by slaves, women and wanderers, those who had nothing left to lose. In a world stratified by birth and wealth, it offered belonging to the forgotten. Its gatherings were small, its rituals humble, a meal of bread and wine shared in remembrance of sacrifice. But within that simplicity lay revolution. The Roman world, proud of its gods and laws, struggled to comprehend this new faith. To the empire, loyalty to Caesar was sacred. To Christians, only God was supreme. When disasters struck, fires, plagues, famine, the Christians were blamed. Under Nero, they were hunted, crucified, burned alive to light the gardens of the emperor. Yet persecution only strengthened them. Martyrs died singing hymns, their courage shaking the spectators who had come to mock them. Each death became seed for conversion. Across the centuries that followed, the faith grew underground, in catacombs beneath Rome, in remote villages of Anatolia, in the deserts of Egypt, where hermits sought communion with God in solitude. The more the empire tried to extinguish it, the brighter it burned. By the 3rd century, Christianity was no longer a rumor. It was a movement. Entire families, towns, and even soldiers began to convert. Philosophers debated it. Emperors feared it. Then came one man who changed everything, Constantine, in 312 CE, on the eve of battle at the Milvian Bridge. Constantine saw a vision in the sky, a cross of light with the words, "In this sign, conquer." The next day, he triumphed. Interpreting the vision as divine favor, he ended the persecution of Christians and issued the Edict of Milan, granting freedom of worship throughout the empire. The faith of outcasts became the faith of emperors. Constantine built churches, summoned bishops, and sought to unify the doctrine of a movement that had splintered across continents. At Nicaea, theologians gathered to define the core of belief, the nature of Christ, the Trinity, the creed that would bind millions. Christianity became not only a religion, but a structure, a spiritual mirror of the empire itself, with bishops in place of governors, councils in place of senates, and Rome itself as its heart. But power changed everything. The church that began in poverty now walked in palaces. The cross that symbolized suffering became a banner of war. As centuries passed, the empire and the faith became inseparable, two bodies sharing one soul. When the Western Empire began to crumble under the weight of invasions and decadence, It was Christianity that outlived it. While emperors fell, bishops endured. While armies broke, the faith adapted. Monks in remote monasteries copied sacred texts by candlelight, preserving the wisdom of both the Bible and the ancients. Missionaries crossed mountains and seas, bringing the gospel to barbarians who would one day build their own kingdoms atop Rome's ruins. The transformation was absolute. The empire that once crucified Christ now called itself Christian. The persecuted had become the inheritors. But the faith was not the same as it had been by the lakes of Galilee. It had grown, institutionalized, theological, imperial. It had absorbed philosophy and law, ceremony and hierarchy. The spirit of the carpenter still lived within it, but now it spoke in the language of emperors. And yet, despite all this, the heart of Christianity remained what it had always been, the conviction that the human soul could commune directly with the divine, that compassion was stronger than power, that forgiveness was mightier than vengeance. It survived because it spoke to the deepest hunger of civilization, the need to believe that suffering has purpose, that love can outlast death, and that eternity is not a palace in the clouds, but a kingdom within. In the centuries to come, that message would reshape the world again, carried by missionaries, defended by crusaders, questioned by philosophers, painted by artists, sung by choirs, beneath stained glass domes. But its beginning was never in those splendors. It began with a man walking barefoot across the hills of Galilee, telling his followers to love their enemies. And though empires would rise and fall around his name, that voice, soft, human, unarmed, would continue to echo across the ruins, whispering the same radical truth that faith is fire, and once it is lit, it cannot be conquered. The empire that had once ruled the world began to crumble, not with a single fall, but through centuries of slow unraveling. The marble roads that had stretched from the Atlantic to the Euphrates cracked and faded. The legions, once disciplined and unstoppable, thinned into mercenaries. The cities emptied, the aqueducts dried, and the statues of emperors were swallowed by vines. But while Rome's body withered, its spirit scattered like embers, carried by faith, by memory, by the stubborn endurance of those who refused to let civilization die. The collapse of the Western Roman Empire was not a thunderclap, but an echo fading across generations. Corruption hollowed the government, civil wars fractured loyalty, and enemies pressed on every frontier. To the north, Goths, Vandals, and Franks pushed against the borders. To the east, the Persian and later the Arab powers waited. Rome no longer had the will to hold its vast inheritance. Its citizens, once united by law and language, now turned to local rulers for protection. Authority fractured, and in its place rose 1,000 small worlds. In 410 CE, the unimaginable happened. Alaric and his Visigoths marched into Rome and sacked it, the first time in 800 years that the eternal city had fallen to a foreign army. To the Romans, it was the end of the world. Pagans blamed the Christians. Christians blamed sin. But even as the flames consumed the temples, a philosopher from North Africa, Augustine of Hippo, began writing a book that would redefine the meaning of collapse. In his City of God, Augustine argued that Rome's fall was not the end of civilization, because true civilization was not built of stone or law, but of faith. The earthly city, he wrote, rises and falls, but the city of God endures forever. His vision would shape the medieval mind, a new order rising from the ashes of the old, where heaven, not empire, became the center of the world. The political landscape shattered into fragments. Germanic kingdoms took root across Europe, the Visigoths in Spain, the Ostrogoths in Italy, the Franks in Gaul. These new rulers adopted Roman customs even as they dismantled its institutions. They converted to Christianity, spoke Latin in their courts, and minted coins in the emperor's image. They did not see themselves as destroyers, but as heirs. In the ruins of empire, the idea of Rome survived, an idea that power could be lawful, moral, and eternal. In the East, that idea remained flesh. From the ashes of Rome rose its twin, Byzantium, the Eastern Roman Empire, with its capital at Constantinople. There, amid gold mosaics and domed cathedrals, the Roman dream lived on for another 1,000 years. The Byzantines called themselves Romans long after the West had forgotten the name. Their emperor, Justinian, sought to restore the old glory, reconquering Italy and North Africa, and codifying Roman law into the Corpus Juris Civilis, a body of legislation that would one day form the foundation of European jurisprudence. Justinian's reign was magnificent, but it was also haunted. The empire he rebuilt was brilliant, but brittle, besieged by plague, rebellion, and enemies at every border. Yet from his world came one of humanity's greatest monuments, the Hagia Sophia, the Church of Holy Wisdom. Its dome, vast and weightless, seemed to hang from heaven itself, glowing with the light of eternity. Within its walls, marble, glass, and faith fused into something transcendent, a declaration that beauty could survive ruin. Meanwhile, in the decaying West, survival meant adaptation. The Latin world became rural, its great cities shrinking into shadows of their former selves. Roads crumbled, trade faltered, literacy waned. The world that had once been connected by empire became a patchwork of isolated valleys and villages. But in the monasteries, far from the noise of politics, monks preserved the memory of the world that was. They copied manuscripts by candlelight, the Bible, the writings of Aristotle, Virgil, Cicero, and countless others. Each letter, each stroke of ink, was an act of defiance against oblivion. They built libraries and scriptoria that would one day feed the Renaissance, though they did not know it. To the outside world, they seemed cloistered, silent, irrelevant, but in truth, they were saving civilization one page at a time. Faith filled the vacuum left by empire. The church became the new spine of Europe, the only institution with memory, wealth, and unity. Bishops replaced governors, abbots replaced generals, and the Pope in Rome became the symbolic heir to Caesar's throne. But this new power was not forged in conquest. It was moral, spiritual, and universal. Christianity, once persecuted, now ruled the rhythm of daily life, marking time with bells, guiding the harvest with festivals, giving meaning to suffering with promises of paradise. Cathedrals rose where temples had fallen, their stained glass painting light into color, their spires pointing heavenward as if in longing. Yet this new age of faith was not without its darkness. Fear of heresy and sin grew alongside devotion. The boundaries between heaven and hell were enforced with violence. The same faith that inspired mercy also justified cruelty. In the name of salvation, countless wars and persecutions would come. But even so, the Church's endurance gave Europe a fragile coherence, a framework that held humanity together through centuries of uncertainty. Amid this spiritual transformation, new peoples emerged from the mists of the north. The Franks, led by Clovis, united Gaul and embraced Christianity. The Anglo-Saxons carved kingdoms in Britain. The Lombards settled in Italy. Each adopted fragments of Roman order, merging them with their tribal traditions. Out of chaos, a new civilization was forming, one that was neither fully Roman nor fully barbarian, but something in between, medieval. Still, the memory of empire haunted the imagination. Poets, monks, and kings dreamed of restoring the lost unity of the ancient world. The title Emperor of the Romans remained a prize to be claimed, a ghostly inheritance. And centuries later, one man would reach for it again, a Frankish king named Charlemagne, who would forge a new empire from the ruins of the old. But before his rise, the world had to pass through darkness. The long night of the early Middle Ages, when Europe slept under the weight of its own forgetting. The roads were overgrown, the libraries few, the frontiers uncertain. And yet, even in that obscurity, humanity continued its slow, stubborn climb. For every kingdom that fell, another language was born. For every ruin, a new faith took root. The empire had died, but civilization, that delicate flame, had not. It flickered in monasteries and markets, in prayers and memories, in the hope that the world could still be rebuilt. And from the east, beyond the sands of Arabia, a new voice was beginning to speak, one that would rise from the desert and change the course of history again. It would not come bearing the sword of Rome, nor the philosophy of Greece, nor the laws of Persia. It would come with words, simple, rhythmic, absolute. A revelation, carried by a man alone in the dunes, whispering of one God, one truth, one humanity. Civilization had fallen once more into fragmentation, but the cycle had not ended. It had only turned its face toward Mecca. The deserts of Arabia shimmered under the weight of silence, vast plains of wind and time, where caravans moved like shadows across the dunes. For centuries, this region had existed at the edge of empires, too dry to conquer, too wild to control. Traders carried incense, gold and silk between east and west, stopping at oases where stories were traded as freely as spices. And it was in this land forgotten by history's great powers that one of humanity's most transformative revolutions began, not of empire, but of faith. In the year 610 CE, a merchant named Mohammed withdrew to a cave near Mecca, seeking solitude and clarity. There, according to Islamic tradition, he heard a voice, the angel Gabriel, commanding him to recite. What followed was not a philosophy, not a treaty, but a revelation, the Quran, a message from God to humanity. Its language was unlike anything heard before, measured, fierce, luminous. It spoke of justice, of unity, of mercy, of the oneness of God, and the equality of all who submitted to him. At first, Muhammad's words were met with disbelief and hostility. Mecca was a city of merchants, its economy built on idolatry and pilgrimage to stone gods. His message threatened that order. He and his followers were persecuted, mocked, driven into exile. But they carried their faith with them to Medina, where they built not just a refuge, but a community, the first ummah, bound not by blood or tribe, but by belief. From Medina, Islam spread with astonishing speed, not merely as conquest, but as conviction. Within a century of Muhammad's death in 632 CE, his followers ruled an empire that stretched from the Atlantic to the Indus. Damascus, Baghdad, Cairo, Cordoba, cities of light rose from the dust. But what made this civilization extraordinary was not its armies, it was its mind. The early caliphs, ruling from Damascus and later Baghdad, inherited the ruins of Greece, Persia, and Rome. Where others had burned libraries, they built them. Where others saw pagan knowledge as heresy, they saw it as revelation through reason. The House of Wisdom in Baghdad became the beating heart of a new world, a place where scholars of every faith worked side by side, translating Aristotle, Galen, and Euclid into Arabic. Ideas that had slept for centuries awoke in the desert sun. The mathematician Al-Khwarizmi created algebra, the language of balance and logic that still underlies science today. Ibn Sina wrote the Canon of Medicine, a text so comprehensive it would guide physicians for 700 years. Al-Razi identified smallpox and measles, distinguishing science from superstition. Alhazen, experimenting with light and lenses, laid the foundations of optics. Astronomers mapped the heavens with an accuracy no civilization had achieved before. They measured the Earth's circumference with astonishing precision, named the stars, and charted the motions of planets. The night sky became a page of divine geometry, its order a mirror of God's perfection. In philosophy, thinkers like Al-Farabi, Averroes, and Al-Ghazali wrestled with questions that still haunt the human spirit: the relationship between faith and reason, revelation and doubt. They translated and debated Plato and Aristotle, arguing not to imitate the Greeks, but to refine them. Knowledge in their hands became a form of worship. Even the language of the Quran inspired innovation. Arabic, with its fluid curves and intricate symmetry, became both a tool of expression and an art form. Calligraphy turned words into beauty, poetry into architecture. Mosques rose across the empire, not as mere places of worship, but as reflections of divine order. Their domes and arches carried mathematics in stone, their mosaics glimmered with verses written in eternal patterns. At its height, the Islamic world was a vast network of intellect and trade, caravans crossing the Sahara, ships gliding from Aden to Zanzibar, scholars traveling from Cordoba to Samarkand, Hapa, once a Chinese secret, spread westward through Muslim hands, revolutionizing learning. Books multiplied, libraries bloomed. A single scholar might own 1,000 volumes, a luxury unimaginable in earlier ages. But this was not merely a civilization of men. Women, too, were part of its fabric. In cities like Damascus and Cairo, women taught in madras, owned property, and served as patrons of art and education. The poet Rabada Aladoya preached a love for God so pure it transcended dogma. Her verses still recited by mystics today. Among those mystics were the Sufis, seekers who turned inward, seeking God not in doctrine, but in experience. To them, every heartbeat was a prayer, every breath a remembrance. They whirled in dance, sang in longing, and taught that love, not fear, was the path to truth. Their poetry, in the words of Rumi and Hafiz, became timeless scripture for the soul. While Europe stumbled through the wreckage of Rome, the Islamic world lit the path forward. Its hospitals offered free care to all. Its observatories predicted eclipses. Its universities, like Al-Azhar in Morocco and Al-Azhar in Cairo, became centers of knowledge that would one day inspire the great universities of Europe. Yet this golden age was not eternal. Power, as always, breeds division. The unity of the early Ummah fractured into rival dynasties: Abbasid, Umayyad, Fatimid, Seljuk, each claiming the mantle of legitimacy. Theologians quarreled over orthodoxy. Rulers fought for control of the faith's heartlands. In the east, Mongol horsemen gathered. In the west, crusaders marched beneath the sign of the cross. In 1258, the unthinkable happened. The Mongols stormed Baghdad, sacked the city, and threw its libraries into the Tigris. The river ran black with ink for days. The House of Wisdom was gone, and with it, the heart of the Islamic Golden Age. But even this destruction could not erase its legacy. The knowledge preserved and expanded by Muslim scholars had already flowed outward, translated into Latin, carried by merchants and monks into Europe. The Renaissance that would soon dawn in Florence owed much to the deserts of Arabia and the scholars of Baghdad. The Islamic civilization had not merely preserved the past, it had transformed it. It took the fragments of Greece, Persia, and India and forged them into a new synthesis, one that saw no contradiction between faith and inquiry, between devotion and discovery. It is easy to forget, in the noise of later centuries, that once the world's greatest scientists began their day with prayer. that the same hands that measured the stars also turned the pages of Holy Scripture, that the quest for knowledge was seen not as defiance, but as obedience, an act of worship in the language of reason. The Islamic Golden Age was not an empire of conquest, but of connection, a bridge of light between the ancient and modern worlds. It reminded humanity that truth, like God, is infinite, that no civilization owns it, and none can extinguish it. And as the ink of Baghdad dried and Europe began to awaken, the torch that had been passed across generations flickered once more, this time in the cathedrals and workshops of a continent about to rediscover itself. The light that had risen in the desert was not lost, it had merely changed direction. Soon on the far edge of the Mediterranean, another dawn would break, born not in revelation, but in rebirth. For nearly 1,000 years, Europe had lived in the long shadow of faith, its cathedrals reaching toward heaven, while its eyes remained fixed on eternity. But as the 14th century dawned, something began to stir beneath the cloisters and bell towers. It began quietly, like a breath, the sound of parchment rustling, of ink scratching across forgotten manuscripts. In the libraries of monasteries and the merchant cities of Italy, the past was waking. The Renaissance, the rebirth, was not a moment but a movement, a slow ignition that transformed the medieval world into the modern. It began in the city-states of Florence, Venice, and Genoa, where wealth from trade met the restless curiosity of the human mind. Merchants who had once commissioned altarpieces for their salvation began to commission portraits for their glory. Artists, philosophers, and scientists no longer sought only the divine, they sought the human. Florence, cradled in the hills of Tuscany, became the laboratory of this rebirth. Its streets thrummed with commerce and conversation, its guilds sponsoring painters, sculptors, and architects who dared to look at the world anew. Among them was a young sculptor named Filippo Brunelleschi, who gazed upon the half-finished dome of Florence's cathedral, an engineering impossibility, and decided to defy gravity itself. With gears, pulleys, and mathematical genius, he built the Great Duomo, a masterpiece of proportion and vision that would crown the city and announce a new age. Brunelleschi's dome was not merely a feat of architecture, it was a declaration that reason and faith could coexist, that the mind of man made in God's image could understand creation through number and form. His contemporary Donatello carved marble into motion, sculpting figures that breathed with realism and vulnerability. No longer were human bodies stiff symbols of holiness. They were flesh, bone, and soul, the divine seen through the human. Then came Leonardo da Vinci, who saw no boundary between art and science. He dissected corpses to study anatomy, sketched flying machines centuries before their invention, and painted faces that seemed to think. His Mona Lisa smiled with the secret of all creation, that the human face itself was a universe. And there was Michelangelo, the sculptor who saw figures trapped within stone and freed them with his chisel. His David, carved from a single block of marble, stood not as a biblical symbol, but as an emblem of human courage. Later, on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, he painted the moment of creation, God's hand reaching toward Adam's, not commanding, but touching, a gesture that defined the Renaissance itself. Art had rediscovered life, but behind the beauty lay philosophy, the humanism that redefined the purpose of knowledge. Scholars like Petrarch and Erasmus returned to the texts of Greece and Rome, translating them, debating them, resurrecting their wisdom. They saw in the ancients not idols but companions, thinkers who had once wrestled with the same questions. What is virtue? What is beauty? What does it mean to live well? Humanism did not reject faith. It rebalanced it. If the Middle Ages had seen man as a sinner before God, the Renaissance saw him as a participant in creation. The divine spark was not beyond reach. It burned within the mind. Knowledge became a form of devotion, curiosity, an act of praise. Across the continent, this flame spread in Venice. Printers like Aldus Manutius revolutionized learning by putting books into the hands of common people. The printing press, perfected by Johannes Gutenberg in Germany, shattered the monopoly of the monastery. Words once chained to parchment and prayer, now multiplied freely. Ideas traveled faster than armies, igniting rebellion and reform. The same technology that spread scripture also spread science. The Polish astronomer Nicholas Copernicus gazed at the heavens and dared to write that the earth moved around the sun, not the other way around. His theory, quietly published, began the slow unbinding of human thought from dogma. In medicine, Vesalius mapped the human body with precision never before seen. In mathematics, Fibonacci brought Arabic numerals into European calculation, and Luca Pacioli codified accounting, the hidden mathematics behind capitalism. In every field, the human mind stretched its reach, testing the limits of what could be known. Yet the Renaissance was not only about discovery, it was about rediscovery. It reminded humanity that beauty and reason were not contradictions. Music, art, geometry, and philosophy all belonged to the same pursuit, the search for harmony. In Florence's workshops, painters experimented with perspective, a new visual language that gave depth to flat surfaces, turning canvases into windows. Light became a symbol not only of vision, but of enlightenment itself. The cities of Italy gleamed like constellations. In Rome, popes commissioned the rebuilding of St. Peter's Basilica, faith rendered in stone and gold. In Venice, canals mirrored palaces, where painters like Titian captured the play of flesh and shadow, color and desire. In Milan, Leonardo painted the Last Supper, turning divine drama into human intimacy. But as the Renaissance spread northward, its spirit changed. In the colder cities of Flanders and Germany, artists turned their gaze inward. Jan van Eyck painted every hair, every pearl, every reflection in glass, finding holiness in the ordinary. Albrecht Dürer, the German genius, engraved the human form with mathematical precision and moral intensity. The North's Renaissance was one of conscience, not spectacle, a meditation on individuality and faith. And with that introspection came upheaval. The printing press gave voice to dissent, and soon that voice roared. Martin Luther, a monk from Wittenberg, nailed his 95 Theses to a church door, challenging the corruption of the church and igniting the Reformation. What began as a call for purity split Europe in two, unleashing wars, persecutions, and revolutions of belief. But even through blood and division, the Renaissance spirit endured. It taught humanity that thought itself was sacred, that the questioning mind was not rebellion but renewal. The scholar, the artist, the scientist, all became priests of a new kind of worship, the pursuit of truth through observation and reason. By the 16th century, Europe was no longer the continent of medieval kings and cathedrals. It had become a network of ideas, a place where a painter in Florence could influence a mathematician in Krakow, where a printing press in Mainz could change the faith of nations. The human mind had learned to see itself as capable, creative, and infinite. The Renaissance was not simply a rebirth of art, it was the rediscovery of potential. It reminded humanity that we are both mortal and magnificent, that the dust of the earth can imagine the stars. And those stars, once mapped by Islamic astronomers, once worshipped by shepherds and sailors, now called to a new kind of adventurer. The seas that bordered Europe were no longer boundaries, but invitations. Soon, ships would leave these same ports, their sails filled not just with wind, but with ambition. The quest for knowledge would become a quest for the world itself. And as the age of reason gave way to the age of exploration, the Renaissance mind, newly reborn, newly fearless, would carry its light into the uncharted oceans, chasing the edges of the earth to see if there was any end at all. The Renaissance had taught Europe to look inward, to rediscover the mind, to measure, to reason. Now it taught it to look outward, as cathedrals gave way to caravels, and the compass replaced the cross. As the instrument of destiny, the horizon itself became a challenge. The old maps, with their dragons and blank seas, could no longer satisfy a civilization newly addicted to discovery. The world was wide, and for the first time in history, people believed they could know it all. The story began with the sea, and with those who had never feared it. For centuries, Arab and Chinese navigators had traced the routes of trade from Zanzibar to Canton. But now, in the 15th century, a small wind-battered kingdom on the edge of Europe, Portugal, turned seafaring into science. Under Prince Henry the Navigator, Portuguese mariners began pushing south along the coast of Africa, mapping, measuring, learning the winds. They developed the caravel, a light, agile ship that could tack against the breeze and survive the Atlantic's moods. Astronomers at Sagres studied the stars. Cartographers redrew the world with each voyage. In 1488, Bartholomew Dias rounded the Cape of Good Hope, proving that Africa had an end, and that beyond it lay a path to the riches of the East. 10 years later, Vasco da Gama sailed farther still, crossing the Indian Ocean to reach Calicut. The voyage took 2 years, and half his crew perished, but he returned with spices worth 60 times the cost of the expedition. The era of global trade had begun, its sails filled with profit and prophecy. Not to be outdone, the rising kingdom of Spain turned its eyes westward. The world, they believed, must curve back on itself, and if a man could brave the unknown waters, he might reach Asia by sailing toward the sunset. In 1492, Christopher Columbus set out across the Atlantic with 3 ships and a conviction born of faith and ambition. He never found Asia, but he found something far greater, a world that Europe had forgotten existed. The Americas, home to millions of people and civilizations older than Europe's cathedrals, entered the European imagination, not as discovery, but as miracle and myth. To Columbus, the islands of the Caribbean were a gateway to paradise. To his patrons, they were proof that God had granted Spain a divine mission to conquer and convert. The age of exploration was both creation and catastrophe, a moment when the world became one and humanity became divided. Within decades, Spanish conquistadors would march through empires that rivaled Rome. Hernán Cortés, armed with steel, gunpowder, and disease, toppled the mighty Aztec Empire of Mexico. Francisco Pizarro shattered the Inca Empire in the Andes, whose roads and stone cities climbed the sky. These were civilizations of architects, astronomers, and philosophers, yet they fell not only to weapons, but to microbes, smallpox, influenza, measles, invisible conquerors that carried death across continents. The conquest was apocalyptic. Entire peoples vanished, forests burned, gold was melted into coins, temples into rubble. The conquistadors called it glory. The survivors called it the end of the world. Yet even in devastation, something unprecedented occurred, the collision of worlds. For the first time, every shore was connected by a single web of exchange, of goods, plants, animals, and ideas. From the Americas came maize, potatoes, tomatoes, cocoa, and tobacco, foods that would reshape diets from Africa to Asia. From Europe came wheat, sugar, horses, cattle, and iron. From Africa came the most terrible export of all, human lives. The Atlantic slave trade became the dark engine of this new global order, carrying millions of men, women, and children across oceans in chains. This was the other face of exploration, not discovery, but extraction. The empires of Europe carved the world into possessions. Spanish silver from Potosi funded the armies of Europe. Portuguese sugar plantations in Brazil ran on the labor of the enslaved. The same wind that carried missionaries also carried misery. Civilization had gone global, but not equal. Still, amid the violence and greed, the age gave birth to new ways of seeing. Cartographers like Gerardus Mercator projected the round earth onto flat maps, turning geography into geometry. Explorers returned with tales of strange lands and stranger peoples, forcing Europe to confront the limits of its knowledge. The philosopher Montaigne would later write, "Everyone calls barbarous what is not his own practice." It was the first whisper of doubt in a world drunk on certainty. The greatest journey of all came in 1519, when Ferdinand Magellan, a Portuguese sailor in Spanish service, set out to circumnavigate the globe. His ships crossed the Atlantic, threaded the straits at the tip of South America, and entered an ocean so vast and still that he called it the Pacific. Months passed with no land in sight, and men died of scurvy and thirst. Magellan himself would never return, killed in the Philippines, but one of his ships, the Victoria, limped home in 1522, completing the first voyage around the earth. Humanity had encircled its home for the first time. With this revelation, the world no longer seemed infinite. It was finite, fragile, and mapped. The stars that once guided sailors now guided astronomers. The same curiosity that charted oceans would soon chart the laws of nature itself. Back in Europe, maps became mirrors of power. Monarchs commissioned atlases to mark their reach. The Spanish Empire stretched across two oceans. Portugal ruled from Brazil to Goa. England, France, and the Netherlands followed, driven not only by faith and gold, but by the promise of knowledge. Navigation evolved into a science, guided by mathematics, magnetism, and the steady pulse of the chronometer. And yet, for all its ambition, the age of exploration was haunted by paradox. It expanded the human world, yet narrowed the human heart. It united continents, yet divided souls. It was a symphony of courage and cruelty, wonder and destruction. In its wake rose cities that glittered with global wealth. Lisbon, Seville, Amsterdam, London, each one a harbor of empire. In their markets, spices from Java mingled with furs from Canada, silver from Peru with silk from China. A new kind of world was being born. The modern, restless, commercial, and connected. But exploration did not end with geography. Once humanity had mapped the seas, it turned inward again, toward the invisible laws that governed the heavens and the earth. The same age that charted coastlines would soon chart the cosmos. In the coming centuries, telescopes would replace sextants, equations would replace legends, and discovery would no longer mean conquest, but understanding. The sailors had proved the earth was round. Now philosophers and scientists would prove it was knowable. The compass would give way to the telescope, and the next great frontier would not be across the ocean, but across the stars. The age of exploration had unified the world by accident, through greed, glory, and curiosity. But it had also awakened a deeper hunger, the realization that the unknown, once reached, only leads to greater mysteries. For every horizon conquered, another waits, and so humanity, forever restless, began to turn its gaze upward. The Renaissance had taught us to dream of perfection. The explorers had taught us to seek it. Now the age of reason was about to teach us how. After the sails of exploration had stitched the world together, Europe began to look, not across the seas, but beyond the stars. The same impulse that had sent men to the edges of the earth now turned inward, into the laws of nature, the mechanics of thought, and the structure of existence itself. The age that followed was not fueled by gold or conquest, but by curiosity, an insatiable hunger to understand why the world was the way it was. This was the age of reason, or what posterity would call the Enlightenment, the moment when humanity dared to believe that the universe could be understood through observation, experiment, and logic rather than revelation or superstition. It was not born in a single place, but across a constellation of minds, in the workshops of London, the salons of Paris, the libraries of Amsterdam, and the observatories of Florence. It began, as all revolutions do, with doubt. In the early 17th century, the Polish canon Nicholas Copernicus had quietly rewritten the map of heaven, placing the sun, not Earth, at the center of the cosmos. His idea had waited nearly a century in obscurity, whispered among scholars too cautious to challenge the church. Then came Galileo Galilei, who turned a crude telescope toward the sky and saw the truth with his own eyes. The moons of Jupiter orbiting another world, the phases of Venus proving that Earth was not the universe's stage, but just another actor. For his discoveries, Galileo was tried by the Inquisition and forced to recant. Yet his whispered words as he left the courtroom, "E Percy, move, and yet it moves," became the anthem of a new world. Truth, once dictated by authority, would now be measured by evidence. In England, Francis Bacon gave that impulse a method. Knowledge, he declared, must come not from old books, but from observation and experiment, from putting nature to the question. His scientific method became the framework of modern inquiry, transforming curiosity into discipline. From that seed grew the scientific revolution. In the Netherlands, Christian Huygens built clocks precise enough to measure the heartbeat of time itself. In Germany, Johannes Kepler uncovered the laws of planetary motion, showing that the orbits of planets were not perfect circles but ellipses, a geometry of compromise that matched the messiness of nature itself. Then in 1666, as plague ravaged England, a young scholar retreated to his family farm and began to think. Watching an apple fall, he wondered why the moon did not fall too. His name was Isaac Newton, and from his solitude emerged the most powerful synthesis of knowledge humanity had ever achieved. Newton's Principia Mathematica revealed that the same force that pulled the apple to the ground bound the planets in their courses. Gravity, the invisible thread that wove together heaven and earth. The cosmos was no longer a divine mystery, but a vast machine governed by mathematical law. God does not play dice, Newton implied. The universe was rational, predictable, and comprehensible. His equations could describe everything from tides to eclipses, from the flight of a cannonball to the dance of galaxies. For the first time, humanity saw the cosmos not as chaos, but as order. The implications were seismic. If nature could be explained without miracles, what else could? If the stars followed laws, perhaps societies did too. The universe was no longer a kingdom of gods. It was a republic of laws waiting to be discovered. The Enlightenment extended this logic to every realm of human life. Thinkers began to question monarchy, superstition, and the divine right of kings, with the same vigor scientists had questioned Aristotle. In the cafes of Paris and the salons of Vienna, they gathered to debate liberty, reason, and the nature of man. René Descartes declared, "Cogito, ergo sum," I think, therefore I am. With those words, he placed consciousness itself at the center of philosophy. Truth was no longer handed down. It began within. Baruch Spinoza, a lens grinder from Amsterdam, envisioned God not as a distant creator, but as the essence of nature, infinite, lawful, alive in everything. In England, John Locke argued that the mind at birth was a tabula rasa, a blank slate shaped by experience, and that government derived its legitimacy from the consent of the governed, not the will of the monarch. In France, Voltaire wielded wit as a weapon, skewering tyranny with irony. Montesquieu articulated the separation of powers. Rousseau demanded the social contract between ruler and ruled. These ideas did not remain in books. They burned their way into revolutions. Across the Atlantic, a group of colonists declared independence in 1776, invoking the Enlightenment's creed: all men are created equal. In France, the cry of liberté, égalité, fraternité echoed through the streets, toppling thrones and remaking society. But even as reason triumphed, shadows grew beneath its light. The same rationalism that sought liberty also built empires in the name of progress. The same curiosity that mapped the stars began to map humanity, dividing it by race, by measurement, by supposed hierarchy. The Enlightenment had liberated the mind, but it had not yet freed the conscience. Still, its legacy was irreversible. Across Europe and beyond, literacy soared, printing presses multiplied, and ideas traveled faster than armies. Denis Diderot's Encyclopédie attempted to capture the sum of all human knowledge, the first great attempt to democratize wisdom. Science and philosophy merged into a single human project to understand everything. In laboratories and workshops, discovery accelerated. Robert Boyle studied the pressure of gases. Antony van Leeuwenhoek, peering through his microscope, saw life teeming in a drop of water. Benjamin Franklin captured lightning in a kite string and proved it was electricity, the same force that powered the human body and illuminated the sky. The Enlightenment's final gift was not certainty, but method, the belief that knowledge could progress endlessly. It transformed the scholar into an explorer, the experiment into an expedition, the question into the compass of civilization. Music, too, reflected this order and optimism. In the salons of Vienna, Mozart, Haydn, and later Beethoven composed symphonies that mirrored the balance of the cosmos. Harmony, contrast, resolution. Art became a science of feeling, science and art of precision. By the end of the 18th century, Europe's imagination had outgrown its boundaries. The world had been mapped, the heavens measured, and yet something restless remained. For all its clarity, reason could not explain the ache of beauty, the terror of love, the mystery of being. The heart had begun to rebel against the tyranny of intellect. Soon a new generation would rise, poets and dreamers, revolutionaries and romantics, who would look at the mechanical universe Newton had described and whisper, "But where is the soul?" The pendulum of civilization would swing again, as it always does, from order to passion, from logic to longing. But before that new dawn, the Enlightenment would leave one final, indelible mark, the conviction that humanity could, through thought alone, reach the infinite. It had begun with telescopes and compasses. It ended with a revelation far more daring, that the universe was not ruled by gods, nor kings, nor fate, but by reason itself. And that reason, fragile though it was, lived within every thinking being who dared to ask, why? The Enlightenment had taught humanity to think, but thought, once awakened, demands action. By the end of the 18th century, the calm geometry of reason gave way to the unpredictable chemistry of revolution. What began in philosophy spread to politics, to industry, to war, a chain reaction of ideas igniting the world. The old order, built on thrones and superstition, began to crack under the pressure of a single unstoppable conviction that human beings could govern themselves. The first sparks came from across the ocean, In the North American colonies, 13 provinces of the British Empire bristled under taxes and decrees issued by a distant king. No taxation without representation, they cried, not as a slogan but as a principle. In 1776, they declared independence, invoking Enlightenment ideals as their charter. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. It was both a promise and a paradox, written in a land where millions were enslaved, yet it marked the beginning of something irreversible, the belief that liberty was not a gift of rulers, but a right of birth. The American Revolution was less a war than an experiment, the testing of philosophy in the fire of battle. When the colonies triumphed, the world watched in astonishment. A republic had defeated an empire. The success of this fragile nation proved that reason and freedom could coexist, that sovereignty could flow upward from the governed. But across the Atlantic, in France, the idea became something far more volatile. The French monarchy had grown decadent and detached, its people starving while its palaces gleamed. When the debt from aiding America strained the treasury, the crown called for new taxes, and the people, long silent, found their voice. In 1789, the storming of the Bastille signaled more than rebellion. It was the birth cry of a new world. The streets of Paris became laboratories of democracy. The National Assembly abolished feudal privilege, proclaimed the rights of man and of the citizen, and declared that sovereignty resided not in kings but in the people. For a brief moment, it seemed that the dream of equality had triumphed. Then came the terror. Revolution, once unleashed, devoured its own children. The guillotine became the emblem of purification. The same ideals that had freed men now demanded their heads. Robespierre preached virtue through violence. Liberty became lawless. Europe trembled as monarchs armed their armies to crush the contagion of revolution. But the fire only spread. From the chaos rose a man who would reshape the continent. Napoleon Bonaparte, soldier, strategist, visionary, and tyrant. He promised order after the storm, discipline after delirium. In his hands, the ideals of revolution transformed into empire. His armies carried not just muskets, but modernity, the Napoleonic Code, the blueprint for civil law, spreading across Europe. Yet beneath the banners of glory lay ruin. From Lisbon to Moscow, battlefields burned. Millions died. When the smoke cleared, the map of Europe had been redrawn, and the myth of divine monarchy lay shattered. But revolution was not confined to thrones and parliaments. In the workshops and factories of Britain, another kind of upheaval was underway, quieter, more enduring, infinitely more transformative. In the damp air of Manchester and Birmingham, water wheels and coal furnaces began to hum. Artisans became laborers, handcraft gave way to machine. The Industrial Revolution was born, and with it, the modern world. It began with invention, the spinning jenny, the steam engine, the power loom, devices that multiplied human productivity beyond comprehension. Coal became the lifeblood of progress, iron its bones. Trains thundered across the countryside, binding cities into a single breathing organism of commerce and speed. Yet beneath the roar of progress lay the groan of suffering. The same factories that made fortunes for merchants devoured the lives of workers, men, women, and children, laboring 16 hours a day for wages barely enough to live. Cities swelled with the poor, their air thick with smoke, their rivers black with waste. The machine had made mankind powerful, but not yet humane. Philosophers and reformers grappled with this new reality. Adam Smith had once written of the invisible hand of the market, of self-interest serving the common good. But as wealth concentrated in the hands of the few, others began to ask, what of justice, what of dignity? Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels saw in the factory system a new kind of slavery, not of chains, but of hunger. Their communist manifesto thundered with prophecy: "Workers of the world, unite. You have nothing to lose but your chains." And yet, progress was not without light. Science advanced hand in hand with industry. James Watt's engines powered exploration. Michael Faraday's experiments with electricity opened unseen worlds. The same age that birthed smoke and steel also gave rise to medicine, sanitation, and education. The modern city, though grim, became a crucible of innovation. The revolutions of the mind and machine changed everything: politics, economics, even time itself. Clocks became masters of labor. Schedules replaced seasons. Humanity had broken the cycle of nature and replaced it with the rhythm of industry. Meanwhile, the spirit of revolution rippled outward. In Haiti, enslaved people rose against their French masters, defeating Napoleon's armies and founding the first Black Republic. In Latin America, leaders like Simón Bolívar and José de San Martín led liberation movements that broke centuries of colonial rule. Across the globe, the dream of self-determination burned, a contagion carried not by armies, but by ideals. But freedom, as always, came at a price. The revolutions of the 18th and 19th centuries unleashed not only liberty, but nationalism. The belief that identity, language, and destiny were bound by blood and soil. Nations were born, but so were borders and wars. The promise of equality hardened into the politics of belonging. The modern age had arrived, brilliant and terrible. Humanity had learned to command engines, to harness electricity, to govern itself. Yet it had not yet learned to govern its appetites. The same fires that forged progress could easily turn to destruction, and they would. For the first time, the power that once belonged only to gods, the ability to reshape the earth itself, lay in human hands. The Enlightenment had given us reason, revolution had given us force. The next century would test whether either could contain the other. The world, once divided by kingdoms, was now a single restless organism, connected by railways, cables, and commerce, but haunted by inequality and ambition. Monarchs still wore crowns, but now their power trembled before the crowd. The people had discovered their strength, and no one could make them forget it. The fire that had begun with words in pamphlets and whispers in cafes now roared across continents. It burned churches and factories alike. It melted empires into nations. It was the fire of freedom, but also the forge of modernity, bright, unstoppable, and perilously close to consuming its makers. And in its glow, humanity stood at the edge of something entirely new. A century that would be both magnificent and monstrous. The age of kings had ended. The age of mankind had begun. By the mid-19th century, the earth itself seemed to tremble beneath humanity's growing mastery. Smoke rose like banners above the new cities of iron and ambition. London, Berlin, New York, Manchester, Tokyo, places that pulsed with power day and night. The world had never moved so fast, nor dreamed so big. But behind the glitter of progress lurked something darker, the reawakening of empire, dressed not in divine right this time, but in the language of civilization and science. The Industrial Revolution had made nations hungry for coal, for cotton, for markets and metals. Factories devoured resources faster than any one country could supply. Railroads and telegraphs stitched continents together, but they also made conquest efficient. Across the globe, Europe's powers looked outward again, not as explorers this time, but as masters. In the 1800s, the sun never set on the British Empire. From India to Canada, Australia to Africa, British flags fluttered over nearly a quarter of the world's population. The French built theirs across North and West Africa, the Dutch in Indonesia, the Russians across Central Asia, the Americans across the Pacific, and the Japanese, newly industrialized and ambitious, began carving their own empire in East Asia. This was imperialism not of caravans and galleons, but of steamships, rifles, and ideology. Colonies became laboratories of power. Railways were laid not for natives, but for exports. Borders were drawn with rulers across tribal lands. Entire peoples were reduced to statistics and subjects. The conquerors spoke of progress, of the white man's burden, of bringing order to primitive worlds. The cruel poetry of paternalism, masking the machinery of extraction. Nowhere was the paradox sharper than in India, jewel of the British crown. Ancient cities and villages were bound by rail, their fields turned into monocultures for imperial trade. Indian cotton fed the mills of Manchester, Indian soldiers fought Britain's wars, Indian famine filled its ledgers. Yet within that vast contradiction, a new consciousness began to form, the first whispers of nationalism among the conquered. The colonizers had taught their subjects to read, to reason, to question, and soon they would regret it. At home, the industrialized nations worshipped progress like a religion. The great exhibitions of London and Paris displayed engines, telegraphs, and textiles, as if they were relics of divine creation. Cities glowed with gas lamps, trains shrieked through tunnels, newspapers reached every hand. But for every glittering boulevard, there were 10 back streets of soot and hunger. The poor lived in the shadow of the machine, their labor invisible, their lives expendable. Writers and artists began to rebel against the cold perfection of industry. The Romantics, poets like Wordsworth, Shelley, and Blake, cried out for beauty, emotion, and nature in an age of smoke. Painters turned their canvases toward sunsets and storms, finding the sublime in what could not be tamed. The world had learned how to measure everything, but it had forgotten how to feel. Meanwhile, science continued its relentless march. Charles Darwin, aboard the Beagle, peered into the mysteries of life and saw a new truth, that all creatures, including humanity, were products of evolution, not design. His On the Origin of Species shattered the idea of divine permanence. The same logic that had explained the stars now explained life itself. But to many, Darwin's discovery was terrifying. If humanity was not chosen, what meaning did it have? Industry answered with invention. The second half of the 19th century brought an avalanche of creation: the telephone, the light bulb, the internal combustion engine, photography, anesthesia, dynamite, the typewriter, the elevator, the steam turbine, the radio. Cities rose higher, time compressed further. Thomas Edison, Nikola Tesla, and Alexander Graham Bell became the new magicians of modernity, men who tamed electricity and made light out of darkness. But every invention had its shadow. The same dynamite that built tunnels destroyed armies. The same railroads that carried commerce also carried conquest. Technology had outpaced morality. In Europe, nations armed themselves with the fruits of their own brilliance. Industrial might turned workshops into armories. The unification of Germany under Otto von Bismarck transformed the balance of power. The wars of ideology that had once toppled monarchs now gave way to wars of machinery. The world became an armed engine, humming with pride and paranoia. Yet amid the noise, the human spirit kept pushing for justice. The abolition of slavery spread from Britain to the Americas, achieved not by kings, but by moral outrage and rebellion. Frederick Douglass, Sojourner Truth, and Harriet Tubman spoke freedom into existence. Abraham Lincoln enshrined it in law. The old chains of empire and race were cracking, though not breaking. Women, too, began to demand their voice. The suffragists marched through streets, wrote pamphlets, and endured prison for the right to vote. Deeds, not words, they declared, their banners held high. The fight for equality was no longer confined to philosophy, it had become lived struggle. The machine age changed how humanity saw itself. For the first time, distance was an illusion. A telegram could cross an ocean in seconds. A photograph could freeze time. A locomotive could outrun the sunset. The globe was shrinking, but human ambition was not. In art, impressionists like Monet, Degas, and Renoir captured the fleeting beauty of light, the shimmer of a city at dusk, the motion of a dancer mid-turn. In literature, Dostoevsky, Dickens, and Ibsen explored the machinery of the soul, guilt, poverty, rebellion, redemption. The modern mind was learning to see the world as both magnificent and unbearable, a contradiction as vast as the age itself. At the century's end, optimism reigned. Electricity illuminated the night, medicine conquered disease, and the air was thick with belief in infinite progress. The world had been mapped, measured, and mechanized. At the dawn of the 20th century, humanity stood taller than ever before, and closer to the edge than it realized. No one could imagine that the same trains carrying goods would soon carry soldiers, or that the same chemicals curing infection would soon suffocate armies. The empires that proclaimed civilization were already sowing their own ruin. The 19th century had been the triumph of power, steel, empire, and invention, but its reward would be fire. The machine that had made men gods would soon remind them of their mortality, for in the century to come, progress would meet its reckoning. The age of optimism would shatter in the thunder of guns, and from its smoke would rise a new kind of world, forged not by kings or conquerors, but by the unbearable lessons of war. The 20th century did not arrive quietly. It came with the hum of engines, the glitter of electric light, the pulse of jazz, and the illusion that humanity had finally mastered its fate. The world's great cities sparkled with confidence. Paris, Berlin, New York, Tokyo, all alive with invention, art, and motion. Trains crossed continents, airplanes stitched the sky, and voices traveled through the air on invisible waves. Humanity seemed unstoppable, but beneath the optimism, the empires of the industrial age were trembling. The very forces that had built them, nationalism, technology, pride, were now turning inward, volatile and uncontainable. The new century would prove that progress could be as deadly as it was dazzling. In 1914, a single bullet shattered the illusion. In Sarajevo, a young Serbian nationalist assassinated Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne. It was a small act, one of 1,000 sparks in a world soaked in rivalry, but it ignited an inferno. Within weeks, treaties and alliances turned Europe into a machine of war. The Great War, as it was then called, was unlike anything humanity had ever endured. Millions of men marched with songs of glory into a nightmare of mud, wire, and gas. Industrial progress had given them engines of destruction. Their generals could barely understand. Machine guns mowed down waves of soldiers in seconds. Artillery shells cratered landscapes into moons of death. Poison gas crawled across trenches, burning lungs and blinding eyes. The sky itself became a battlefield, biplanes circling like hawks, their pilots dueling in thin air. The front lines froze from the North Sea to the Alps, a graveyard that stretched for hundreds of miles. For 4 years, the world bled for inches of dirt. By the time the guns fell silent in 1918, more than 16 million lives had been extinguished. Kingdoms crumbled: Austria-Hungary, the Ottoman Empire, Tsarist Russia, and with them, the old order of the world. The survivors returned home to cities they no longer recognized. The war had not only killed men, it had killed faith, faith in progress, in reason, in civilization itself. The poet Wilfred Owen wrote, "My subject is war, and the pity of war. The poetry is in the pity. Out of that despair came revolution." In 1917, amid hunger and chaos, Russia rose against its Tsar. What began as protest became transformation. Under Vladimir Lenin, the Bolsheviks seized power, declaring a new world of equality, the first communist state. The red flag over the Kremlin symbolized both hope and terror. For some, it was the dawn of justice. For others, the beginning of tyranny. Meanwhile, the victors of the Great War redrew the world at Versailles. They carved new nations out of old empires, divided lands, and imposed reparations so crushing they sowed the seeds of future catastrophe. Germany, humiliated and impoverished, seethed with resentment. The treaty meant to end war had only postponed it. The 1920s glittered with contradiction. In the United States, the Roaring Twenties brought jazz, skyscrapers, and the liberation of women who danced to rhythms that scandalized their elders. Radios filled homes with music. Automobiles turned distance into freedom. Cities sparkled and stock markets soared. But prosperity was uneven, and greed was unrestrained. In 1929, the illusion collapsed. The Great Depression swept across the globe like a plague of poverty. Banks failed, factories closed, and millions were thrown into unemployment. In the chaos that followed, demagogues rose, men who promised order through hatred, power through fear. In Italy, Benito Mussolini revived the ghost of Rome through fascism. In Germany, Adolf Hitler transformed resentment into ideology, turning a broken nation into a weapon. His vision was absolute: one race, one leader, one destiny. The world watched, weary from war, unwilling to believe another could come. But by 1939, the storm broke again. Germany invaded Poland, and the world plunged into darkness. World War II was total, a war of nations, machines, and ideologies. The tank replaced the horse, the bomber replaced the sword, and civilians became targets. Entire cities became battlefields. In Europe, Hitler's armies conquered continent after continent, under the symbol of the swastika. In the East, Japan, driven by its own imperial dreams, swept across Asia and the Pacific. The war was global, but its horrors were intimate, felt in every home, every breath. At its heart was a crime unlike any before. In the death camps of Auschwitz, Treblinka, and Sobibor, millions of Jews, along with Roma, Poles, disabled people, and dissidents, were systematically exterminated. The Holocaust was not a byproduct of war. It was its soul, the industrialization of murder. Civilization itself stood trial, yet amid the darkness, courage endured. In Britain, civilians huddled in basements as bombs rained down during the Blitz, refusing to surrender. In France, resistance fighters sabotaged railways and smuggled messages through sewers. In the frozen ruins of Stalingrad, the Soviet people held against annihilation. On the beaches of Normandy, Allied soldiers landed under fire, inching forward against impossible odds. By 1945, the Axis powers lay in ruins. Hitler was dead, his empire reduced to rubble. Japan, still defiant, faced a new horror, the birth of the atomic age. When the bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the world saw its own apocalypse. In a single flash of light, tens of thousands vanished. Humanity had split the atom, and with it, the boundary between life and annihilation. The war's end brought neither peace nor certainty. The victors turned to face each other, the United States and the Soviet Union, allies in war, opposites in ideology, now divided the globe into rival spheres. The Cold War began, fought not with armies, but with propaganda, espionage, and fear. The 20th century had promised progress. Instead, it had delivered paradox. The same century that cured disease and conquered flight had also built gas chambers and nuclear bombs. It had connected continents through radio and telephone, even as it split humanity into camps of ideology and terror. But out of the ashes, something fragile survived, a longing to rebuild. The United Nations was founded in 1945, not as an empire, but as a promise that humanity could learn from its own devastation. Europe, scarred and weary, turned to cooperation, planting the seeds of what would become the European Union. In the ruins of Tokyo and Berlin, children played among the debris, unaware they were the first generation of a new world. The war had ended, but the age of peace was uneasy. The bomb had made the world one, united not by compassion, but by the knowledge that a single spark could end everything. Humanity had built machines of infinite power and learned too late the fragility of its own heart. The wars had changed more than maps. They had changed the meaning of civilization itself. No longer could progress be measured by conquest or invention alone. The test of the coming age would be moral, not mechanical. Could humanity survive its own genius? The century of fire had burned everything. Kings, empires, illusions. What remained was ash, and buried within it, the faint, stubborn ember of hope. When the smoke of the Second World War lifted, the world did not return to peace. It froze. The battlefield had shifted from trenches to ideology, from nations to narratives. The two surviving superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, emerged as mirror images of conviction, one promising freedom through capitalism, the other equality through communism. Between them stretched an invisible frontier of fear, the Iron Curtain, a phrase that would define an era when humanity lived under the shadow of its own extinction. It was a war without declarations, fought through proxies, secrets, and symbols. The globe became a chessboard. Every country, every movement, every revolution seemed to fall into one orbit or the other. The weapons had changed, no longer muskets or swords, but missiles, ideology, and information. The enemy was not always seen, but always felt, a presence in the headlines, in the air raid drills, in the very imagination of an anxious age. The world's first great confrontation of this new reality came not on a battlefield, but in a city split in two, Berlin. Once the heart of a defeated empire, it became the front line of the Cold War. To the west, neon lights and jazz. To the east, grey concrete and propaganda. In 1961, a wall of barbed wire and stone cut the city in half, not just separating streets and families, but dividing the 20th century itself. Beyond Europe, the rivalry spread like wildfire. The Korean Peninsula became the first true proxy war, a brutal conflict between North and South, between communism and capitalism, fought by millions and ending in a stalemate that still scars the earth today. In Vietnam, the pattern repeated. Idealism turned to quagmire, victory to disillusionment. The jungles burned with napalm, and the young of the world began to question not only governments, but the very notion of authority. The Cold War was fought as much through culture as through armies. Propaganda became an art form. The West broadcast consumer freedom through Coca-Cola and Hollywood, through jazz and blue jeans, a soft power as seductive as any army. The East answered with parades of rockets, banners of workers, and the proud rhetoric of solidarity. Both sides built their myths, their martyrs, their monsters, and above it all, like a sword hanging by a single hair, hovered the nuclear bomb. In 1949, the Soviets detonated their first atomic weapon, ending America's brief monopoly on apocalypse. The arms race began in earnest. Hydrogen bombs followed, weapons 1,000 times more powerful than those dropped on Japan. Tests lit up the skies over the Pacific. The air itself became poisoned with fallout. By the 1950s, a new word entered every household: mutually assured destruction. The logic was chilling, that survival depended on the certainty of annihilation. Peace, paradoxically, was maintained through terror. Children practiced hiding under desks, as if wood could shield them from the sun of Judgment Day. In cities, sirens were tested. In bunkers, plans were drawn for the unthinkable. The world had achieved what no civilization before had dared: the ability to end itself. And yet, even as fear hardened the world's borders, human imagination broke free of gravity. In 1957, a small silver sphere, named Sputnik, streaked across the sky, sending a pulse from the Soviet Union to every radio on Earth. It was the first artificial satellite, and the opening shot of the space race. For the first time, humanity's war extended beyond its own planet. The United States responded with urgency, pouring resources into science and education. E-rockets became symbols of destiny. In 1961, Yuri Gagarin, a young Soviet pilot, became the first human in space, orbiting Earth with a smile that crossed every frontier. 8 years later, the answer came from across the ocean: Apollo 11. When Neil Armstrong stepped onto the surface of the moon in 1969, half the planet watched in awe. In that single moment, the species that had once huddled around fires beneath the stars had finally touched them. But while humanity reached upward, it also turned inward. The Cold War coincided with an explosion of civil movements that reshaped societies from within. In America, the Civil Rights Movement, led by figures like Martin Luther King Jr., challenged centuries of racial injustice through nonviolence and moral conviction. His dream, broadcast to millions, echoed beyond race. It became a manifesto for all who believed the human conscience could bend history. In the streets of Paris, Prague, and Mexico City, students demanded freedom from conformity, equality for women, dignity for workers, and an end to war. The year 1968 burned with protests and assassinations, with hope and despair intertwined. Old hierarchies, political, cultural, sexual, cracked under the weight of a generation that refused to inherit its parents' silence. Technology continued to blur the lines between progress and peril. Computers, once the size of rooms, began to shrink into tools of communication. Television turned politics into performance. In every home, images of war, moon landings, and protests flickered side by side, creating a new kind of consciousness: global, restless, uncontainable. Meanwhile, the superpowers continued their cold dance of brinkmanship. In 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis brought the world within a breath of annihilation. For 13 days, humanity stood on the edge as American and Soviet ships faced each other in the Caribbean. It was the closest civilization had ever come to collective suicide, and then restraint. At the last moment, the bombs stayed silent. The missiles were withdrawn. The world exhaled. In the decades that followed, détente offered a fragile reprieve: treaties, summits, handshakes. But the underlying tension never disappeared. Wars continued on the periphery, in Afghanistan, in Africa, in Latin America, each a shadow theater of the greater conflict. The global South became the battleground for ideologies born in European capitals. Yet change, as always, came from within. In the Soviet Union, stagnation replaced utopia. The dream of equality had curdled into bureaucracy and fear. When Mikhail Gorbachev rose to power in the 1980s, he tried to breathe life back into the system through openness and reform. But it was too late. The pressure of decades cracked the Iron Curtain from the inside. In 1989, crowds gathered in Berlin once more, not to fight, but to celebrate. They climbed the wall that had divided their lives, chipped at it with hammers, and passed through its holes like pilgrims crossing into light. The Berlin Wall fell, and with it, the Cold War began to thaw. 2 years later, the Soviet Union itself dissolved, not with explosions, but with exhaustion. A century that had begun with empires ended with one collapsing under the weight of its own contradictions. And yet, the end of the Cold War was not peace. It was transition. The fear of annihilation faded, but a new unease took its place. The world was no longer divided into two, but into many. A network of nations, corporations, and technologies connected in ways no one could fully understand. For 50 years, the Cold War had been the stage on which humanity's hopes and terrors were projected. Now that stage was empty, but the actors had not left. The weapons remained, the ideologies lingered, and the anxiety endured. The 20th century had survived its own apocalypse, only to enter a new kind of tension, the tension of possibility. The bomb was still there, silent in its silos, but the real revolution was beginning elsewhere. In the invisible circuits of machines, in the whispers of code, in the growing realization that the next age would not be fought with soldiers, but with information. The war of empires had ended. The war of networks was about to begin. When the Berlin Wall fell and the Cold War melted into memory, humanity believed it had finally stepped into the light. The world that had been divided by barbed wire and ideology now seemed bound together by circuits, satellites, and invisible signals. The 20th century had been a war of empires and machines. The 21st would become a war of information. In the 1990s, a quiet revolution began, not with armies or flags, but with a sound, the crackle and hum of a modem connecting to the internet. For the first time in history, distance lost its meaning. A teenager in Tokyo could speak to a stranger in Toronto. An artist in Lagos could share their work with Paris in seconds. Knowledge, once locked in libraries and universities, became free, infinite, and immediate. The dream of the Enlightenment had finally found its medium. At first, the digital world felt utopian, a frontier of pure possibility. Early pioneers spoke of a global village, a place where all voices could be heard and all minds could meet. The web was democratic, chaotic, alive, a pulsing network of human creativity. From message boards and chat rooms grew an entirely new civilization, one without geography, where identity could be invented and ideas could spread faster than governments could censor them. But every revolution carries its shadow. The same connectivity that united humanity also began to fracture it. Information, once a rare treasure, became a flood. Truth drowned in abundance. The web, ungoverned and infinite, mirrored not only the brilliance of the human mind, but also its prejudice, its cruelty, its hunger for validation. Technology was no longer a tool, it was an ecosystem. In the dawn of the new millennium, a handful of companies rose to shape that ecosystem. Digital empires without borders, ruled not by kings, but by algorithms. Search engines indexed the world's knowledge. Social networks rewired its relationships. Friends became numbers, likes became currency, and privacy, once sacred, evaporated in the glow of screens. The smartphone arrived like a revelation, compressing the planet into a palm. Every human being became a broadcaster, a chronicler, a node in a vast web of perception. Moments that once faded into memory were now captured, filtered, and shared instantly. The world no longer waited for news, it was the news. And yet, behind the convenience, a quiet transformation was taking place. Every click, Every search, every heartbeat of curiosity left a trail, data. Invisible to most, it became the new gold of the digital age. Companies mined it, sold it, and built predictive models that knew people better than they knew themselves. The dream of global connection had given birth to a new form of power, surveillance capitalism, where behavior itself was the commodity. The 21st century unfolded in waves of contradiction, connection and isolation, transparency and control, progress and fragility. The early optimism of globalization, the belief that trade and technology would erase conflict, collided with the persistence of inequality and identity. The planet had become small, but humanity's divisions had not. When the Twin Towers fell in New York City on September 11, 2001, the illusion of a borderless utopia was shattered. Terror had gone global. The wars that followed, in Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, dragged the world back into cycles of fear and vengeance. Technology amplified both empathy and extremism. The same networks that carried messages of peace also carried propaganda and hate. Meanwhile, new forces began reshaping civilization. Climate change, once a distant theory, became an immediate reckoning. Wildfires, floods, storms, droughts, nature reminding humanity of its arrogance. The industrial age had built a world of abundance, but left behind a fragile planet, warming faster than politics could comprehend. Scientists warned of tipping points. Activists took to the streets. The young began to see the future, not as promise, but as inheritance of peril. In the same decades, machines began to think. The algorithms that once organized information started to interpret it, to predict, to learn. Artificial intelligence emerged not as fiction, but as fact. Self-learning systems wrote poetry, diagnosed disease, composed symphonies, and drove cars. For the first time, humanity had created something that could create. Intelligence without consciousness, thought without suffering. It was both miracle and mirror. AI revealed not how smart machines could become, but how transparent humans were, how easily we could be read, modeled, and influenced. The same tools that recommended songs and films began to shape elections, manipulate opinions, and filter truth. At the same time, space, once a dream of nations, became a market of billionaires. Rockets that had once symbolized superpower, rivalry now bore corporate logos. Humanity had left the Cold War behind, only to enter a colder frontier, one where ambition soared higher than philosophy. We reached again for the stars, but we carried our same questions with us. Who are we? What do we deserve? What does progress mean? In homes across the world, the old rhythms of life dissolved. Time accelerated. People woke to screens, worked through screens, loved and mourned through screens. The digital realm became the real one, the place where work, identity, and emotion lived. Then came the pandemic. Invisible, viral, global. In 2020, a microscopic particle brought the planet to a halt. Borders closed, streets emptied, economies paused. For the first time in living memory, the entire species faced the same fear at once. But the internet, built for curiosity, became a lifeline, connecting families, doctors, teachers, and strangers in isolation. Humanity survived, not by walls or weapons, but by communication. Out of that silence came reflection. We saw how fragile our systems were, how dependent we had become on technology, and how desperately we needed one another. The world had grown vast through machines, yet meaning remained human. Now, in the early decades of the 21st century, we stand on the edge of something both exhilarating and terrifying. Artificial intelligence writes our news, climate systems groan under our weight, genetic engineering edits life itself. We have achieved what no civilization before us dared to imagine. We can reshape reality. But the question that began in the caves of prehistory still lingers. To what end? We can communicate across continents, but can we understand one another? We can simulate love, but can we feel it? We can predict the weather, but not our own wisdom. For every line of code written, for every satellite launched, the oldest paradox remains, that knowledge without meaning is power without direction. And yet there is hope in this new mirror age, a fragile, flickering hope. Never before have so many voices been heard, so many injustices named, so many truths shared in real time. Art once confined to galleries, now lives in memes, music, and messages seen by billions. The same tools that divide also unite. The same web that ensnares us can also set us free. Humanity stands, once again, between creation and chaos, but this time with full awareness of its reflection. The machine now shows us who we are. The planet demands that we decide who we wish to become. And perhaps that is the truest measure of progress, not our ability to build, but our capacity to choose for civilization. After all its empires, its wars, its revolutions, and its miracles, was never a story of technology. It has always been the story of a species trying to understand itself, to find meaning between the stars and the screen, between the ancient and the algorithmic, between memory and possibility. The digital age is not the end of history. It is the beginning of awareness, of a humanity learning to see its own reflection in the infinite mirror it has built. And the reflection stares back, asking the oldest question in the newest form. Now that you can create everything, what will you create of yourself? From the fires of the first forge to the glow of a billion screens, humanity's story has always been one of light. The kind we make, the kind we lose, the kind we keep searching for. We've crossed oceans, empires, and eras in pursuit of meaning. And though the tools have changed, from stone to code, from myth to machine, the heart behind them has not. Our history is not a record of what we've built, but of what we've become, and the future, as always, is waiting for the next question we dare to ask. If you've enjoyed this journey through time, subscribe, like, and turn on the notification bell, so you'll be the first to know when a new story of humanity's past and its unfolding future arrives.